Vought International built a trillion-dollar empire by putting capes on lab rats and convincing the world they were gods. Then a man fell from the sky in a battered orange gi who didn't want a contract, didn't need compound V, and could shatter a tectonic plate just by stretching his hamstrings. For the very first time in his miserable, manufactured life, Homelander looked across a room and felt the one thing Vought's PR department couldn't spin. Pure, unfiltered terror. The night the sky broke, three things happened across the eastern seaboard at the exact same second. Every bird went dead silent. Every dog started screaming. And deep in the concrete bowels of Vought Tower, a dust-covered monitoring console that hadn't blinked in 11 years started to shriek. Dr. Anita Brewer was halfway through a tragic, cellophane-wrapped egg salad sandwich when the primary klaxon hit. She was the head of extraterrestrial biological threat assessment, a ghost department, a tax write-off buried under infrastructure maintenance Tier 9. In 9 agonizing years of employment, her biggest thrill had been an Arizona space rock that made lab rats heal 5% faster. She wrote a 400-page thesis on those rats. Literally no one read it. So when the alarm went off, a bone-rattling, mechanical wail she had programmed herself a decade ago and completely forgotten about, Anita violently choked on her sandwich. She slammed her knee into the underside of the desk, appended a lukewarm coffee across her keyboard, and just stared at the main monitor with a smear of yellow mustard on her chin. The numbers were garbage, they had to be. She wiped her face with a shaking wrist, squinted at the harsh glare of the screen. Still garbage. That's, she wheezed, leaning in so close her nose almost touched the glass, desperately hoping proximity would make the math behave. That's not physically possible. It wasn't measuring a radiation bloom or a heat signature. It was raw bioelectric kinetic potential, the electrical exhaust of a living nervous system. Every soup had one. Homelander's was the baseline ceiling, a number so massive Vought used it as a psychological club to keep the board in line. This is God. This is the absolute limit of compound V. The limit had just been obliterated. If Homelander's biosignature was a match striking in a dark room, the thing currently tearing through the thermosphere was a dying star, and it was actively deciding whether or not to go supernova. Anita snatched her desk phone, dialed her supervisor, ringing. Dialed the director of special assets, voicemail. Her palms were actually sweating. She wiped them furiously on her slacks and dialed Ashley Barrett, because Ashley Barrett answered her phone at 3:00 a.m. Ashley Barrett was biologically incapable of ignoring a ringing phone, and right now, that neurotic, ulcer-inducing flaw was the only thing keeping Anita from having a full-blown panic attack. Ashley picked up on the first ring. This better be a literal fucking fire, Brewer. Something's in the atmosphere, Anita gasped, the words tumbling out in a frantic, unformatted rush. Something alive. It's not a soup, Ashley. It's not from here. And whatever it is, it's bigger than anything we have ever put on a chart. A long, heavy silence on the line, just the faint sound of Ashley's ragged breathing. How much bigger? The reading wasn't measuring a heat signature or a radiation bloom. What her instruments were detecting was something her team had theorized about in a white paper 3 years ago, bioelectric kinetic potential. The measurable energy output generated by a living organism moving through space. Every soup had one. Homelander's was the largest ever recorded, a number so enormous that Vought used it internally as a kind of psychological cudgel. This is what human potential looks like when perfected through compound V. This is the ceiling. The ceiling, it turned out, had just been removed. Whatever was falling toward Earth wasn't radiating in the range Homelander operated in. It wasn't even in the same order of magnitude. If Homelander's output was a candle, what Anita was looking at was a star, and not a modest one. A star in the process of deciding whether or not to go supernova. She picked up her phone and called her supervisor. He didn't answer. She called the director of special assets. Voicemail. She called Ashley Barrett's direct line, because Ashley Barrett answered every call regardless of the hour, because Ashley Barrett was constitutionally incapable of not answering a call. And that flaw, Anita had decided long ago, was the woman's single most useful professional quality. Ashley picked up on the first ring. This better be. Something is entering the atmosphere, Anita said. Something alive, something that is not a soup, something that is not from here, and whatever it is, Ashley, it is bigger than anything we have ever looked at. A long silence. How much bigger? Anita low. Oaked at the readout again, ran the calculation a third time, felt the specific, nauseating vertigo of a scientist watching their entire framework of understanding dissolve in real time. Millions of times, she said quietly, millions of times stronger than Homelander's biological output. The silence on Ashley's end lasted 4 full seconds. Anita counted. I'll wake him up, Ashley said and hung up. Him meant Stan Edgar, and the fact that Ashley Barrett, a woman who once sprinted through a hallway in heels to tell Homelander his coffee order was ready, was now referring to Edgar with that particular reverence told Anita everything she needed to know about how seriously this was about to be taken. The meteor, if you could call it that, and Vought's official communications team would spend 3 days arguing about whether to call it that, hit the ground at 3:17 a.m., 14 miles outside of Yonkers, in a field that belonged to a dairy farmer named Gerald Putz, who was asleep and would wake to find his property had become, overnight, the most surveilled piece of real estate in the Northern Hemisphere. The impact wasn't explosive in the way you'd expect something traveling at that velocity to be. No mushroom cloud, no shockwave that leveled trees for a mile in every direction. Instead, witnesses, a trucker on the interstate, 2 insomniacs, a teenager filming what he thought was a meteor shower for TikTok, described something more like watching a controlled landing that had gone slightly wrong. A light, impossibly bright and warm rather than harsh, descending in a long arc. A sound like the air itself was being pushed aside politely. Then a deep, resonant boom that shook windows 12 miles away, followed immediately by silence. Genuine silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that swallowed it. The crater was 30 feet deep and roughly circular. At its center, when Vaught's first response team arrived 18 minutes later, because Vought maintained a rapid deployment unit for exactly this category of event, another thing that didn't officially exist, they found him. He was standing at the bottom of the crater. Not injured. Not confused in the way a person would be confused after falling from space. He was looking up at the night sky with an expression that could only be described as thoughtful, the way someone looks when they're trying to remember whether they left the stove on. His clothes were strange, orange and blue, a style that matched no cultural or corporate aesthetic in Vaught's database, which one analyst would later note suggested either extraterrestrial origin or extraordinarily committed cosplay. His hair defied physics. His eyes, when he finally looked down at the response team with their weapons raised and their hands shaking, were dark and clear and completely, unnervingly calm. "Hey," he said. The team leader, a former Navy SEAL named Marcus, who had once subdued a level 6 soup with a suppression compound and a taser, and who did not frighten easily, later told his debrief team that the single most alarming thing about the encounter was the complete absence of threat in the man's demeanor. He wasn't performing calm, Marcus said. He wasn't suppressing aggression. He was just calm, like nothing about our guns or our numbers registered as a factor he needed to consider. Not because he was dismissing us. More like, you ever seen a grown man walk past a kid pointing a toy gun at him? Not scared, not condescending, just not relevant. The team held position. The man in the crater looked around at the upturned earth, at the scorch marks, at the distant glow of the interstate, and then back at Marcus. "I think I'm in the wrong place," he said, with the particular tone of someone who has been in the wrong place before and has developed a philosophical relationship with the inconvenience. "What planet is this?" Marcus lowered his weapon exactly 1 inch, just one, involuntarily. "Earth," he said. The man's face broke into a wide, genuine smile, not the practiced, brand-managed smile of a Vought soup, not the cold performance of someone like Homelander who had learned to use warmth as a tool. This was just a real smile, unfiltered and immediate, the kind children have before they learn that smiling too much in front of strangers is a vulnerability. "Oh good," he said, "I've been here before, different timeline maybe, but still." He paused, looking up at the sky again. "The energy signature's a little off, something's wrong here." Nobody on the response team knew what to say to that. In the end, it was Anita who had driven out personally, because wild horses could not have kept her in that basement, who stepped forward from behind the tactical line, past Marcus's outstretched arm, and looked down into the crater. "Wrong how?" she asked. He looked at her with what she would later describe as genuine appreciation, the specific appreciation of someone W. Ho has been met with curiosity instead of fear, and finds it refreshing. "Dark," he said simply, "the energy here in people, whatever made them strong." He tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when they're listening to something others can't hear. It's not natural, something was done to them. A small frown crossed his face, brief but real. "That doesn't happen where I come from. Power isn't given, it's earned." Anita felt the hair on her arms stand up. Because here was the thing she would include in her report, the thing that would travel up Vought's chain of command and land on Stan Edgar's desk like a grenade with the pin already pulled. It wasn't the power readings that made this man terrifying. It was what the biological analysis confirmed 3 hours later, when they'd managed to collect ambient cellular material from the crater site and run it through every screening protocol Vought had developed in 40 years of studying enhanced humans. No compound V. Not a trace, not a degraded metabolite, not a synthetic marker, not even the ghost of artificial biological modification. His cellular structure was unlike anything in the database, denser, more adaptive, operating on a mitochondrial efficiency that human biology had no framework to explain, but it was entirely, completely, provably natural. No laboratory had built him. No corporation had manufactured his power. No injection at 6 months old, no childhood trial, no carefully managed dosage had produced what he was. He had simply become this. And that, more than the readings that broke their instruments, more than the fact that he'd survived atmospheric entry the way a person survives a light jog, more than the calm in his eyes when armed men pointed weapons at him. That was what made Stan Edgar set down his coffee, look at the report, and say nothing for a very long time. Because Vought's entire empire was built on a single, foundational lie that had been told so many times it had calcified into something resembling truth. That extraordinary power required extraordinary intervention. That gods had to be made. That without compound V, without Vought, without the infrastructure and the science and the investment and the control, there was no such thing as a superhero. There was no sailing that nature could reach on its own. There was no version of this story where the corporation wasn't necessary. Standing in a crater outside Yonkers, looking up at the night sky with dirt on his boots and stars in his eyes, was a man who made their entire mythology a lie. Not with malice, not with an agenda, just by existing. Edgar closed the folder, looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city that Vought had, in every way that mattered, quietly purchased over the course of 3 decades. "Find out everything," he said to Ashley, his voice carrying the specific, measured quality of a man deciding how large a problem actually is before deciding what to do with it. What he wants, what he knows, what he is. A pause, and keep him comfortable, for now. Ashley nodded and left. Edgar remained at the window. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that Vought owned and he occupied like a king occupies a country, with total authority and total isolation, Homelander was asleep, dreaming whatever it was that Homelander dreamed. And somewhere outside Yonkers, in a Vought containment facility that didn't officially exist, a man who had fallen from space was probably asking someone if they had any food, because that, Anita had noted in her field report with a kind of bewildered scientific detachment, had been his second question after confirming the planet. The first had been about the energy. The second had been about food. Whatever he was, wherever he came from, he was, at his core, something Vought had never successfully manufactured and never successfully destroyed. Simple, and in Edgar's experience, nothing was more dangerous than that. The press conference was Ashley Barrett's idea, which meant it was Ashley Barrett's problem. Which meant she hadn't slept in 41 hours and was currently vibrating on her 4th sugar-free Red Bull inside a handicapped bathroom stall, giving herself the kind of frantic pep talk that would have resulted in an immediate psychiatric hold. You managed Homelander for 6 years, she whispered, staring at her bloodshot eyes in the mirror. Her hands were actually shaking. You managed Homelander. You can manage one guy who fell out of the sky. She took a long, burning sip, stared harder. He smiled at the tactical team, she muttered, gripping the edge of the sink as if trying to anchor herself to the earth. He asked for food. He said, please, he is fine. This is completely fine. She shoved out of the bathroom. Nothing was fine. Stan Edgar's decision to go public had taken exactly 4 minutes. It wasn't the obvious move, not when the asset in question had 0 leverage points, no VOT contract. No engineered childhood trauma safely filed away in the archives. The usual architecture of control, the compound V dependency, the manufactured origin stories, the blackmail, none of it applied. This man had dropped into their lap with absolutely nothing Vought could hold over his head. Which meant, Edgar realized with the terrifying, cold clarity that built his empire, their only viable option was to make the entire world believe he already belonged to them. We announce him before someone else does, Edgar had told the boardroom, 6 hours after the crater stopped smoking. We frame the narrative right now while we still own the frame. By the time the Pentagon or foreign intelligence figures out what crawled out of that dirt, we have already introduced the world to Vought's newest hero. He hasn't agreed to anything, the chief legal officer pointed out, sweating through his collar. He hasn't disagreed, Edgar replied softly. That is enough for a press conference. They put him in a sterile glass conference room with Ashley, 3 brand consultants, and a guy named Derek. Derek had managed the rollout of 3 mid-tier sups and possessed an aggressive confidence that completely masked his total lack of competence. Derek had prepared a 40-slide deck. Title slide SDRKSON, Vought's first extraterrestrial hero. We're calling him Starkson, Derek beamed, clicking to a mock logo dripping in Vought's signature corporate red, white, and blue. It tests beautifully in the Midwest, strong, American adjacent, a little bit of cosmic mystery. The sun suffix implies heritage, like he's from something, like there's a mythology. Goku was sitting in a $1,200 ergonomic mesh chair with the slouched, easy posture of a guy waiting for a bus. He looked at the logo, then at Derek, then at Ashley. My name is Goku, he said pleasantly. Right, and we love that personally. Very authentic, Derek backpedaled, his smile tightening, but in terms of global market positioning. Goku, he said again, not defensively, not angry, just the simple, polite repetition of a man clarifying a fact he assumed you had misheard. Derek looked at Ashley. Ashley looked at her empty Red Bull can and desperately wished it was vodka. We'll circle back on the name, she managed to say. They did not successfully circle back on the name. The costume was a longer conversation, and also a much shorter one in the sense that it hit a brick wall at 200 miles an hour. Vought's R&D team had produced a masterpiece, a tactical suit threading the needle between alien royalty and aggressive patriotism. Deep midnight blue, gold accents, and a chest emblem Derek described as cosmic Americana, like if NASA had feelings. It had taken 6 exhausted designers 4 days to fabricate, materials and labor, roughly $340,000. Goku looked at the suit the way you look at a meal you definitely didn't order. I have clothes, he said, hooking a thumb under the collar of the bright orange gi he was currently wearing. A gi that had survived atmospheric re-entry at Mach 40 without a single scorch mark, which either meant the fabric was indestructible or the fabric's durability was entirely irrelevant because of the absolute freak of nature wearing it. Those are, the lead designer started, his voice thick with enormous physical professional pain. Those are very expressive, but for branding purposes. I like them, Goku smiled. They're orange. Yes. Just aggressively orange, entirely. And blue, Goku offered helpfully, pointing to his collar, the undershirt. The designer slowly turned to look at Ashley with the dead, hollow expression of a man who had dedicated his entire life to visual communication and had just discovered its absolute limit. We'll revisit, Ashley croaked. They did not successfully revisit. The press conference was held on the sprawling concrete steps of Vought Tower on a crisp Tuesday morning, beneath a sky that Vaught's meteorological team had obsessively checked twice to guarantee photogenic clarity. The crowd was staggering, not because Vought permitted an enormous crowd, but because the dam had already broken. A shaky, zoomed-in TikTok shot from the interstate had racked up 200 million views before Vaught's legal kill team could issue a takedown notice. By then, it had been ripped, downloaded, and mirrored 40,000 times. The world knew something had landed. They just didn't know what. Ashley Barrett stood at the mahogany podium. She felt the specific, nauseating electricity of a moment she had engineered but no longer controlled, which she sometimes thought was the defining story of her professional life and probably her psychological condition. Today, she projected into the mic. She used the practiced synthetic warmth of someone who had learned warmth the way other people learn a second language, technically correct but with a slight, unnatural accent. Vought International is proud to introduce the world to a hero unlike any we have seen before, a visitor, a protector, and now, a member of the Vought family. She stepped aside, her heart hammering against her ribs. Homelander walked out first. The crowd erupted, a deafening physical wall of noise. They always roared for Homelander, but Ashley had observed over the years that it was rarely about love. It was a primal, animal response to extreme power, a messy cocktail of awe, terror, and the shameful, desperate comfort of knowing the monster was theoretically on your side. Homelander raised one gloved hand. He smiled the smile. The jaw, the gleaming teeth, the crinkled eyes performing joy with such terrifying precision that you almost forgot there was absolutely nothing behind them. Nothing but a cold, bottomless, desperate need to be worshipped. He had been briefed about Goku 4 days ago. He hadn't screamed, he hadn't thrown a tantrum. He had just stood perfectly still, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles jumped, and asked Ashley a single question. Is he stronger than me? Ashley had swallowed dryly. We don't have comparative data yet. Homelander had nodded slowly. He left the room without another word. Later that night, building maintenance logged 3 anonymous complaints about the sharp, metallic stench of ozone and deep, blackened laser burns melting through the drywall on the executive floor. Now he stood at the podium in full uniform, the American flag snapping crisply in the October wind behind his shoulders. He gestured broadly toward the heavy glass doors with the magnanimous, sweeping confidence of a king presenting his newest pet. Goku walked out. I like them, Goku said. They're orange. Yes, just orange entirely. And blue, Goku offered helpfully, the undershirt. The designer looked at Ashley with the expression of someone who had dedicated their career to visual communication and was now confronting its limits. We'll revisit, Ashley said. They did not successfully revisit. The press conference was held on the steps of Vought Tower on a Tuesday morning in October, beneath a sky that had been checked twice by Vaught's weather team and confirmed to be photogenically clear. The crowd was enormous, not because Vought had allowed an enormous crowd, but because the rumors had been circulating for 4 days and the footage from the teenager's TikTok, shot from the interstate, had accumulated 200 million views before Vaught's legal team got a takedown notice issued, by which point it had already been downloaded and re-uploaded approximately 40,000 times. The world knew something had landed. They didn't know what. Ashley stood at the podium and felt the specific electricity of a moment she had engineered but no longer entirely controlled, which was the story of her professional life and probably, she sometimes thought, her psychological condition. Today, she said with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned warmth the way other people learn a second language, technically correctly, occasionally with an accent, Vought International is proud to introduce the world to a hero unlike any we have seen before. A visitor, a protector, and now, a member of the Vought family. She stepped aside. Homelander walked out first. The crowd roared. They always roared for Homelander. It was, Ashley had observed over many years, less about love and more about the specific animal response that extreme power generates in people who are not powerful, a combination of awe and relief, and the faint, shameful comfort of knowing that something terrifying was, at least theoretically, on your side. Homelander raised one hand, smiled the smile. The jaw, the teeth, the eyes that performed warmth with such practiced precision that you almost forgot there was nothing behind them but the cold, desperate need to be seen. He had been told about Goku 4 days ago. He had not said much. He had stood very still and asked Ashley one question: is he stronger than me? Ashley had said, we don't have comparative data yet. Homelander had nodded slowly and left the room, and later that night 3 complaints were filed by building maintenance about laser burn marks on the walls of the executive floor. Now he stood at the podium, in full uniform, American flag snapping in the October wind behind him, and he gestured broadly toward the doors with the magnanimous confidence of a man presenting something he owned. Goku walked out. The crowd's reaction was not what Vought had prepared for. It wasn't silence exactly. It was something more complicated, a kind of confused delight, the way an audience reacts when a comedian subverts the expectations so completely that the laugh takes a second to arrive. Because Goku walked out in his orange gi, which Ashley had ultimately accepted after 40 minutes of negotiation, had yielded absolutely nothing, and he looked at the crowd and the cameras and the microphones and helicopters circling overhead, and the buildings and the sky and the sheer overwhelming density of New York City assembled to look at him, and his face did the most disarming thing possible. It lit up. Not with performance, not with brand management. With genuine, unfiltered delight, the way a child's face lights up at something large and overwhelming and wonderful. There are so many people, he said, leaning toward the microphone, apparently unaware that his voice, even at conversational volume, was carrying perfectly. This is incredible. Someone in the crowd laughed. Then more people laughed. Then the crowd was cheering, which wasn't what Vought had planned. They'd planned awe, they'd planned patriotic gravity. Derek had a whole arc mapped out, but cheering worked. Cheering was fine. Cheering was good, Ashley told herself, watching her carefully constructed press conference dissolve into something warmer and more chaotic than intended. The first interview question came from a CNN correspondent, and it was the question Vought had prepared an answer for, the answer they'd given Goku that morning in a briefing he had listened to with polite attention, and Ashley now understood, zero intention of using. Can you tell us about your mission here on Earth? What does your partnership with Vought mean to you? Goku thought about this. Actually thought about it. There was a pause, genuine and unperformed, the pause of someone consulting an internal process rather than a teleprompter. I don't really have a mission, he said. I came through by accident, but the energy here feels wrong, so I think I might stay for a while and figure out what that is. He paused again, and the food is really good. The crowd lost its mind. Behind him, Homelander's smile remained exactly where it was, held in place by musculature and willpower. Ashley watched it hold. Watched his eyes. Watched the precise, microscopic moment when Homelander understood, not that Goku was a threat, not yet, not consciously, his psychology wasn't built for that kind of forward analysis, but that the crowd's energy was different. That the warmth aimed at the man in orange wasn't the warmth he was accustomed to receiving, wasn't the hot, urgent, needing warmth of people who feared the alternative. It was something easier. Something given freely, without the undercurrent of desperation that Homelander had been fed on for so long he'd mistaken it for love. It lasted 1 second, that understanding. Then the smile adjusted, fractionally. Only Ashley, after 6 years of studying that face with the intensity of someone whose safety depended on reading it correctly, would have noticed. The smile got slightly wider, which meant he was angry. The branding meeting that afternoon was the most professionally painful hour of Ashley's career, and Ashley had once been in a room when Homelander threw a man through a window. The deals are standard, she explained, across a conference table that cost more than most people's apartments, to a man eating the third of a series of meals he'd requested that morning with an enthusiasm that she was starting to find personally affecting. Sponsorships, appearances, a merchandise line. We're thinking a toy range, some apparel. I don't need money, Goku said, genuinely puzzled rather than dismissive. Everyone needs money. What would I buy? Ashley opened her mouth, closed it. Food, she said finally. I can find food. Goku, she set down her tablet, departed briefly from the script. The way this works, the way all of this works. She gestured vaguely at the building, the city, the entire architecture of manufactured heroism that constituted her professional existence, is that the public needs a story, not just a person. A story, who you are, what you stand for, who made you. Without that, you're just a very powerful person walking around, and that terrifies people. He considered this with the same focused attention he gave everything, fully present, no performance of consideration, just actual thought. But I'm not trying to terrify anyone, he said. I know. So why would they be terrified? Ashley looked at him for a long moment, at the open, direct, completely unguarded face of someone who had apparently moved through existence, through multiple existences, across multiple timelines, according to his own casual references, without accumulating the specific scar tissue that made people complicated. Because they don't understand you, she said, and people are scared of what they don't understand. He nodded slowly. Okay, then I'll help them understand. Through the contract. By talking to them, he said, like this, like we're doing now. He smiled. I'll just be honest. Ashley felt a specific, profound despair bloom somewhere behind her sternum. Honesty, she said carefully, is not always on brand. He looked at her with the kind, puzzled expression of someone encountering a concept that doesn't. Deep parse. What's a brand? He asked. Stan Edgar received the debrief at 6 p.m. No contract, no exclusivity, no scripted rescues, which Goku had described as weird, why would you not just actually help people, and which Ashley had not been able to adequately explain. No merchandise agreement, no approved communication guidelines, no restriction on speaking to media, foreign governments, military entities, or anyone else. He had agreed to one thing only, that if there was a genuine threat, something that required fighting, he would help. That's what I do, he'd said simply. Edgar read the notes twice, looked out his window at the city. The public loved him. The numbers from the press conference were extraordinary, trending globally, approval sentiment running at 94% positive, a figure that Homelander hadn't touched since the early years. And it had cost Vought nothing, which meant Vought controlled nothing, which meant what they actually had was not an asset but a variable. A free agent operating in their ecosystem with their implicit endorsement and none of their architecture of management. He was a man they'd publicly claimed and privately couldn't touch. Edgar picked up his phone. Get me Stillwell's old research files on containment protocols, he said to his assistant, and get me everything on Homelander's psychological profile from the last 6 months. He paused. Separately, he added, keep them very separate. 40 floors up in the penthouse that the building's other occupants had learned, through a process of uncomfortable trial and error, to avoid after 9 p.m., Homelander stood at the window. He'd watched the playback 17 times. Not the press conference, not Goku's answers, not the crowd's reaction, not the moment Ashley's smile had gone slightly too fixed. He'd watched the crowd. Specifically, he'd watched the moment Goku had looked at all those people, and his face had gone simple with joy, undefended, unmanaged, open. And the crowd had responded not with the electric, frightened adoration Homelander had spent his entire constructed life manufacturing, but with something that looked, from a forensic emotional distance, like recognition. Like they were meeting someone they already knew, someone whose joy was the same shape as their own. Homelander understood power. He understood fear and what fear produced when it was aimed at someone strong. What he was looking at was something he had no framework for, because it was the one thing nobody had ever given him, the one thing that Vought's entire apparatus of management and manipulation had, perhaps deliberately, ensured he never received. Uncomplicated warmth. Given without leverage. He turned away from the window. In the quiet of the room, in the way that things become true only when there is no audience, no camera, no performance required to sustain them, he felt something move in his chest. Small, sharp. He didn't have a word for it. He had never needed one before. In my opinion, the lab didn't have an official name. The 12 people cleared to know it existed just called it the foundry, not for the poetry of it, for the function. A foundry takes raw material, superheats it, and figures out exactly where it breaks. It sat in the sub-basement of a Vought research annex in northern New Jersey. 3 key-carded doors, 1 dual retinal scanner. Dr. Anita Brewer used to think the security was a theatrical joke. Until tonight, she understood exactly why you bury a room this deep. Getting Goku down here had required what Ashley Barrett's memo diplomatically called creative framing. Translation, they lied. They told him it was a routine physical. Goku had agreed instantly. He possessed the cheerful, maddening compliance of a guy who had literally never associated a doctor's office with vulnerability. Why would he? His body had survived impacts that rewrote the laws of physics. He sat on the freezing steel examination table, happily shoveling down his 4th catered meal of the day, while Anita's tech-stuck cold sensor leads to his chest and temples. "These measure electrical activity," he asked, tapping a diode on his collarbone with genuine interest. "Among other things," the tech lied smoothly. Goku stared up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Back home, there was a guy with a little machine on his eye, read power levels, always thought that was neat, kept exploding though. He scraped the bottom of his rice bowl with a plastic fork. "What does yours measure?" "Everything we can think of," Anita muttered from behind the 2-inch thick observation glass. Goku smiled directly at her, not at the glass, at her. "Good answer," he said around a mouthful of rice. As if he could hear her perfectly through the soundproof barrier, she wasn't entirely convinced he couldn't. Phase 1 passive biometrics, the kind of data you could theoretically excuse as a wellness check. You didn't want to explain to the nice alien why 17. Sweating scientists were huddled behind a reinforced wall, taking notes with the focused intensity of people watching civilization either confirm or collapse. Anita watched the baseline numbers populate on the primary display. That familiar, nauseating vertigo hit her again. The data was refusing to behave. Heart rate 31 beats per minute, normal for an elite sprinter, but the cardiac output, it was a physical impossibility. Each beat moved a volume of blood that should have instantly ruptured human arterial walls. His external temperature was 98.6, but his internal core was running so hot it suggested a metabolic engine with absolutely no biological precedent. Then the brain waves. Resting state, no, it matched the delta waves of a monk deep in a decades-long trance, except monks achieved that by shutting neural activity down. Goku's brain was firing on every single cylinder, every system fully engaged, operating at a frequency so impossibly coherent it just registered as stillness. "He's not resting," Dr. Fuad, her lead neurologist, whispered. His hands were gripping the edge of the console. "That's not a rest state, it's a containment state. He's managing his own output the way we manage a nuclear reactor, deliberately, continuously. He's doing that right now while eating rice. Passively, like breathing." Anita stared through the glass. The man on the table was poking at the wrist sensor, completely oblivious. "Run the cellular analysis," she ordered. That was when the math completely broke. Every soup Vought had ever manufactured operated on the exact same biological law. Compound V was a permanent mutagen. It violently restructured mitochondria, weaponized cellular stress, and turned structural damage into physical enhancement. Soup power was cellular, it was measurable, it was bounded by biology. Cells have ceilings, therefore sups have ceilings. Goku's cells had apparently never received that memo. The imaging didn't show mutation, no artificial enhancements, no ragged, V-induced structural damage. Anita made Fuad run the sequence 3 separate times before she believed the screen wasn't malfunctioning. It was perfection. Not engineered focus group perfection. It was the terrifying, natural perfection of a system refined over millions of years of brutal evolution. An organism so precisely suited to absolute violence that its efficiency was practically theoretical. Every single cell in his body was producing energy. Not converting it, not burning fuel, not as a byproduct of some metabolic process. Directly, cleanly, as a primary function, as if the fundamental purpose of his cellular biology wasn't to sustain life, but to generate raw, unadulterated force. Keeping him breathing was just a polite side effect. "That's not how cells work," whispered Dr. Park, the lead cellular biologist. His voice was completely hollow, the flat, dead tone of a man watching his entire career get shoved into a woodchipper. "No," Anita agreed softly. "Cells convert energy, they burn calories, they physically can't just produce it out of nowhere. That violates." "I know what it violates, Park. Thermodynamics." "I know," Anita snapped a little too loudly. Park didn't blink, he just stared at the glowing display. Where the hell is it coming from? Nobody answered, because the answer the instruments were screaming at them was a career-ending hallucination. It required a massive psychological break before anyone could say it out loud in a Vought laboratory. Anita swallowed hard. She leaned over the console and pulled up the secondary analysis. She had run it manually, 2 nights ago at 3:00 a.m., staring at the crater telemetry until her retinas burned, digging up a theoretical paper she had written in grad school, a paper her advisor had generously labeled imaginative bullshit. "It's not cellular," Anita said, the silence of the room pressing against her eardrums. "The cells are just the output mechanism, the exhaust pipes, the source is deeper." She dragged her cursor over a region of the scan, not a physical structure, not an organ, a shimmering, impossible quality distributed through the tissue, woven into the microscopic dead space between measurable things. "There's a field, it's biological, but it is not biochemical. It permeates the entire body. That's what the cells are drawing from." Park rubbed his face. "That is not in any biology textbook on this planet." "No, it's not biology the way we define it." Anita gripped the edge of the desk. She was about to say it. "It's closer to what certain Eastern philosophical traditions call life energy. Kai, the vital force." Someone in the back scoffed, but Anita didn't flinch. She kept her voice brutally clinical. "Except it is not a metaphor, it is physically real. It is right there, it is measurable, and it is." She hit the enter key to pull up the quantification algorithm. The screen blinked, the processor whined, the number that spat out W. As expressed in scientific notation, 11 digits before the decimal point, a number so fat, so dense, and so violently heavy it practically cracked the glass of the monitor. Very, very large. The room went dead quiet. Every single cell in his body was a furnace, producing raw energy, not converting it, not burning fuel as a byproduct of some metabolic process, just producing it cleanly as a primary function, as if keeping him alive was just a polite side effect of generating apocalyptic force. "That's not how cells work," Dr. Park whispered. His voice was completely hollow, the dead, flat tone of a man watching his entire career burn to ash in a trash can. "No," Anita agreed softly. "They convert, they burn calories, they physically can't just generate it out of nowhere. That violates." "I know what it violates, Park. Thermodynamics." "I know," Anita snapped, rubbing her temples. A dull headache was starting to throb behind her left eye. Park didn't blink, he just stared at the glowing numbers. Where the hell is it coming from? Nobody answered, because the answer the instruments were screaming at them required a massive psychological break before anyone could actually say it out loud. Anita swallowed hard. She leaned over the console, the sterile air conditioning suddenly feeling freezing against her sweat-damp shirt. She pulled up the secondary analysis, the one she'd run manually at 3:00 a.m., digging up a theoretical grad school paper her advisor had generously labeled imaginative bullshit. "It's not cellular," Anita said, the dead silence of the room pressing against her eardrums. "The cells are just the output mechanism, the exhaust pipes, the source is deeper." She dragged a trembling cursor over the scan. Not an organ, a shimmering, impossible quality woven into the microscopic dead space between tissue. "There's a field, it's biological, but it is not biochemical. It permeates the entire body. That's what the cells are pulling from." "That is not in any biology textbook on this planet," Park muttered, rubbing his face. No, it's not. Anita gripped the cold metal edge of the desk. She was about to say it. It's closer to what certain Eastern philosophical traditions call life energy. Kai, the vital force. Someone in the back scoffed nervously. Anita didn't flinch. She kept her voice brutally clinical. Except it is not a metaphor, it is physically real. It is right there, it is measurable, and it is. She hit the enter key to pull up the quantification algorithm. The processor whined. A number spat out in scientific notation, 11 digits before the decimal point. Very, very large. The room went dead quiet, just the hum of the servers and the sound of someone breathing slightly too fast. How large? Dr. Fuad asked, his voice cracked on the second word. Anita turned away from the glass. What she was about to say needed to be said looking people in the eye, not hiding behind a monitor. The modeling team ran a theoretical output projection, she said, her throat dry. Maximum potential energy generation based on the field density, cellular throughput capacity, and biological efficiency metrics. She glanced down at her tablet, not because she needed to. The data was permanently burned into her retinas, but because staring at the glowing glass felt safer than looking at their terrified faces. They couldn't complete it. Fuad frowned, stepping closer. The model crashed. Every cell in his body was producing energy. Not as a byproduct of metabolic process, not as the consequence of biochemical reaction, directly, cleanly, as primary function, as though the fundamental purpose of his cellular biology was not to sustain life but to generate force, and sustaining life was simply what happened along the way. That's not how cells work, said Dr. Park, the cellular biologist, with the flat affect of someone whose professional framework had just been handed a notice of eviction. No, Anita agreed. Cells convert energy, they can't just produce it. That would violate. I know what it would violate. Thermodynamic. I know, Anita said more quietly. Park looked at the display for a long moment. Where is it coming from? Nobody answered, because the answer the instruments were suggesting was one that required a significant psychological adjustment before it could be said out loud in a professional scientific setting. Anita pulled up the secondary analysis, the one she'd run independently at 3 a.m. 2 nights ago, because she hadn't been able to sleep and her mind kept returning to the crater readings and a theoretical framework she'd written in grad school that her advisor had described generously as imaginative. It's not cellular, she said. The cells are the output mechanism. The source is deeper. She highlighted a region of the scan, not a structure, not an organ, but a quality distributed through everything, woven into the space between measurable things. There's a field, biological but not biochemical. It permeates the entire body. It's what the cells are drawing from. That's not in any biology we have. No, it's not biology the way we define it. She paused. It's closer to what certain Eastern philosophical traditions would call life energy. Kai, the vital force. She said it clinically without apology. Except it's not metaphorical, it's physically real, it's measurable. And it is. She pulled up the quantification attempt, which expressed itself in scientific notation that required 11 digits before the decimal point, very, very large. The room was quiet. How large? Fuad asked. Anita turned to face the room properly, because what she was about to say deserved to be said, while looking at people rather than at a screen. The modeling team ran a theoretical output projection, maximum potential energy generation based on the field density, the cellular throughput capacity, and the biological efficiency metrics. She glanced at her tablet, not because she needed to, she'd memorized the number, but because looking at it felt more honest than saying it from memory. They couldn't complete it. The model crashed. The model didn't crash, it completed, but the output value exceeded the parameter ceiling we'd set, so it returned an error. She set the tablet down. We raised the ceiling, ran it again, same result. She paused. We raised it 4 more times. The silence that followed had texture. What was the final number? Park asked. There isn't one, Anita said. That's the result, the model's conclusion, and I want to be precise here because this is what the instruments are saying, not me. I'm just reporting, is that his power output has no theoretical upper limit. The field doesn't deplete. The cells don't degrade under load. The more energy he expends, the more efficiently the system responds. She looked around the room. He doesn't have a ceiling. Based on everything we can measure, he is a system in a state of continuous potential growth with no identified terminus. Dr. Park sat down, not intentionally. His legs simply made that decision. "We need to test the suppression compounds," someone said from the back. The suppression compound trials were the part of the evening that Anita would return to later, in the specific way you return to a memory, not because it was traumatic, but because it contained information that changed your understanding of your own position in the world. They couldn't inject him. No needle in Vought's inventory had successfully breached his skin during the earlier sampling attempts, a problem they'd solved by collecting what they needed from the crater site. Testing the compounds required atmospheric delivery, which required his consent, which they obtained by telling him they were testing an air filtration system. Anita did not feel good about this. Compound V suppressant, the formula Vought maintained in classified storage for what internal documentation referred to as asset management contingencies, was delivered at 3 times the concentration that had successfully neutralized a level 8 soup in a 2019 field test. In the 2019 test, the subject had been incapacitated within 40 seconds. Goku looked up from the table, sniffed twice, and said, "Is something burning?" "They increased the concentration." He tilted his head. "That's an interesting smell." He paused. "A little sweet. Is that the filtration thing?" Maximum concentration. The kind that Vought's own documentation noted should never be deployed in an enclosed space with human personnel due to the risk of neurological damage in unenhanced individuals. On the other side of the glass, 2 technicians were already showing early symptoms of exposure from trace atmospheric bleed. Goku rolled his shoulders, looked around the room with mild curiosity. "It got a little warm in here," he said conversationally. "Is that normal?" That was the full extent of the effect. They cycled through 4 more compounds: neuromuscular inhibitors, biological frequency disruptors. The classified formula designated only as black cell, which had been developed specifically as a theoretical response to a hypothetical maximum tier soup, and which had never been tested on an actual subject because no actual subject had previously warranted it. After black cell, Goku yawned, looked apologetically at the mirror, and said, "Sorry, long day. I'm not bored, I promise. You can keep going." Anita sat down in her chair and did not get up for a while. The weapons assessment was conducted remotely, without Goku's knowledge, and this was the part where Anita's professional detachment finally, after 3 days of extraordinary strain, began to genuinely fracture. It wasn't a physical test. They couldn't run one without his awareness. Instead, her team ran a theoretical assessment, given everything they now knew about his biology, his energy field, his cellular response. Architecture, what would it take to stop him? They started with conventional weapons, high-explosive ordnance, armor-piercing rounds, thermobaric devices. The modeling was swift and merciless. His cellular density and regenerative response made conventional physical damage essentially irrelevant. His body would repair faster than any conventional weapon could destroy. They moved to directed energy, military-grade laser systems, electromagnetic pulse weapons, theoretical particle beam delivery. The energy field presented the problem here. It didn't just absorb incoming energy, it appeared based on the scan data to integrate it, to learn from it. The modeling suggested that a directed energy attack might, after a brief adaptation period, simply make him stronger. They modeled nuclear yield. The conversation around that result was very quiet and very brief. The field density would absorb and redistribute the energy, the modeling lead said, in the tone of someone reading a sentence they wish they hadn't written. At sufficient distance there would be environmental damage, but the subject, he stopped, restarted. The theoretical outcome is that he survives, and the post-event field readings would be higher than pre-event. "You're saying a nuclear weapon would charge him," Anita said. "I'm saying the model says that. I want to be clear that I would very much like the model to be wrong." "But you've checked it." A pause 4 times. Anita stared at the ceiling for a moment. The final assessment was chemical and biological, every compound V variant, every experimental formula in Vaught's classified inventory, every theoretical delivery mechanism. The conclusion synthesized across all vectors was expressed, in the final summary document, in a single sentence that the modeling team had drafted and redrafted 6 times before arriving at the most precise possible language. There is no currently existing drug, weapon, or control architecture capable of reliably stopping, containing, or meaningfully affecting the subject against his will. Below it, one of the junior modelers had added a line that survived into the final draft only because nobody senior noticed it until the document was already printed. The subject is not an asset, the subject is a condition. Stan Edgar read the report at midnight. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without visible reaction, his face performing the same mild attentiveness whether the document in front of him was a quarterly earnings report or a scientific assessment that quietly dismantled every assumption on which his power rested. When he finished, he set it down, poured 2 fingers of scotch, which his doctor had told him to stop doing, and which he had continued doing because he was Stan Edgar and his doctor did not run Vought International. The thing about control, Edgar had understood since very early in his career, was that it was never really about physical force. Physical force was expensive, unreliable, and left marks. Real control was about architecture, building the systems, the dependencies, the psychological frameworks within which a person could only conceive of moving in the directions you'd already prepared for them. You didn't control Homelander by being stronger than him. You controlled Homelander by being the author of his self-image, by owning the narrative he told himself about who he was and what he needed. Everything Vought did, the contracts, the branding, the manufactured heroism, the very idea that SUPs required corporate management to be legitimate, was architecture. Invisible, structural, load-bearing. Goku didn't live in that architecture. Not because he'd dismantled it, not because he'd seen through it, but because he'd arrived from somewhere else entirely, somewhere the architecture didn't reach, and he walked through the spaces between the walls with no awareness that the walls were meant to contain him. He couldn't be drugged, he couldn't be threatened, he couldn't be outgunned. Which left, Edgar reflected, turning the glass slowly in his hands, exactly one viable approach. He could be managed. Not controlled. Management was different from control. Control required leverage. Management required only the sustained, careful cultivation of a person's trust, and trust, Edgar knew, was the most durable material in the world when it was real and the most catastrophically brittle when it broke. The question was whether a man who seemed to possess, as a fundamental quality of his character, the ability to see people with complete and unfiltered clarity could be made to trust something that didn't deserve it. Edgar finished the scotch, considered the man who had arrived in a crater and asked, first, about the energy and second, about the food. The energy, he had said, felt wrong. Edgar set down the glass very carefully. That was the real problem, not the power, not the biology, not the reading that had broken 11 different measures. Immense systems and suggested that the upper limit of what this man could become was a number that mathematics politely declined to name. The problem was that he was already looking. Already somewhere beneath the warmth and the open face and the second and third and fourth servings of rice, there was something older and more precise paying attention to the shape of the world he'd landed in, taking the measure of its energy, the way a doctor takes the measure of a patient, not to cause harm, but to locate it. And in Vaught's world, Edgar understood, a man with unlimited power who was already asking the right questions was not an opportunity. He was a clock. He picked up the phone. Get me everything we have on Homelander's current psychological state, he said, and find out if the boys know about the crater yet. He paused. If they don't, they will soon. People like them always find out. He set the phone down without waiting for a response. Through the window, the city ran its usual midnight operations, bright, indifferent, endlessly consuming. Somewhere out there, in whatever temporary accommodation Ashley had arranged, a man from another world was probably asleep, or eating, or looking at the sky with the particular quality of attention that people have when they're not yet sure if a place is somewhere they're visiting or somewhere they've been sent. Edgar had built an empire on the principle that power without oversight was a catastrophe waiting to be managed. He was looking, for the first time in 30 years, at power that could not be overseen. And the worst part, the part that kept the glass from being refilled a third time, that kept him at the window longer than was useful, was the faint, deeply unwelcome suspicion that the catastrophe this time might not be the man in the crater. It might be what the man in the crater was going to find. There is the possibility that it can be Homelander's idea. That was the part Ashley would come back to later, when she was trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to a crater in the Nevada desert, and a situation that required, before it was resolved, 3 separate crisis communications meetings and a temporary media blackout that Vought's legal team described as aggressive but defensible. It had been his idea, pitched to her on a Wednesday morning with the particular casual energy he deployed when he wanted something badly enough to perform not wanting it. Just a friendly test, he'd said, leaning against the doorframe of her office, arms crossed, the posture of someone completely unbothered. 2 heroes, getting a feel for each other. The public would love it. The public would, Ashley had begun. Love it, he repeated and smiled, and Ashley had recognized the smile immediately, because it was the one that meant the conversation was already over, and she was simply being extended the courtesy of believing she was still in it. She'd approved the location within the hour. Nevada, a decommissioned military testing ground that Vought maintained a quiet lease on for exactly these categories of necessity. 40 miles from the nearest civilian population, reinforced observation bunker, drone coverage for footage that would be released, carefully edited, carefully framed as a promotional event. 2 heroes, friendly terms. The kind of content that generated 9-figure engagement and reminded the world, at regular intervals, that Vought's assets were the most powerful beings on Earth. That had been the premise. Ashley stood in the observation bunker and watched the monitors and thought about the premise. Goku had agreed with the same frictionless ease he brought to most things, which Ashley was increasingly understanding was not the ease of someone who didn't take things seriously, but the ease of someone who assessed situations very quickly and very accurately, and had determined that most of what other people treated as threatening was not, in fact, threatening. He'd asked one question: are we actually fighting, or is it more like seeing what each other can do? Ashley had said it was the latter. He'd nodded, okay, that's fun. He arrived at the testing ground in the clothes he always wore, because of course he did, eating something he'd apparently requested from the transport team's catering supply. He looked at the Nevada flatlands, the dust and the pale sky, and the absolute absence of anything that could be broken, with the expression of someone who had fought in worse venues and would fight in worse still. Homelander was already there. He'd been there for 20 minutes, Ashley's assistant had told her, which was unusual. Homelander was constitutionally incapable of being early to anything because early implied eagerness, and eagerness implied need, and need was a vulnerability he'd spent his entire constructed life performing the absence of. 20 minutes early meant something else. 20 minutes early meant he'd wanted to be there First, to own the ground before the other person arrived, to be the thing the landscape already contained when the other thing showed up. He was standing at the center of the flat when the transport arrived, hands loose at his sides, chin slightly elevated, in full uniform because this was being filmed, but also, Ashley understood, because the suit was armor of a different kind, not physical protection but psychological architecture, the visual language of everything he was supposed to be. Goku stepped out of the transport, finished what he was eating, and looked across the flat at Homelander with an expression that was purely, simply interested. The way a person looks at something they're genuinely curious about. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Homelander said. The drone cameras circled at altitude. In the bunker, monitors showed 4 angles. Ashley stood with her tablet and the specific, practiced stillness of someone who has learned to watch dangerous situations without visibly registering that they are dangerous. Homelander smiled, thought we'd keep it simple, see what you can do, see what I can do. He tilted his head, nothing serious. "Sure," Goku said and rolled his neck once, a small loose movement, purely habitual. "You want to go first?" Homelander's smile held. "Sure," he said, "why not?" The laser vision came without preamble. Full intensity, both eyes. the kind of output that Homelander reserved for situations that required a statement, not a warning, not a demonstration, but a declaration of terminal capability. Ashley had seen him use it twice at that level, and both times the target had ceased to be a coherent object. The beams hit Goku in the chest. He looked down. Then he looked up at Homelander with an expression of genuine, interested attention, like a person who has just encountered a stimulus they want to understand better. "That's heat-based?" he asked. Homelander held the beam for 3 more seconds. The ground around Goku was turning to glass. The air was bending. Goku remained entirely unaffected. "Mostly," Homelander said and stopped. His voice carried nothing. His face carried nothing. Both were performing. "Interesting," Goku said, looking at the fused earth around his feet. "I've seen something similar, not quite the same frequency." He looked back up. "Okay, your speed next." In the bunker, one of the technicians quietly said, Is he coaching him through it?" Ashley said nothing. The super speed was the thing Homelander used when lasers felt too declarative, more intimate, more personal, the demonstration of his ability to be anywhere in the world before you'd registered he'd left. He crossed the 40 meters between them in a fraction of a second, fist already moving at a velocity that had, in previous deployments, punched through reinforced steel like wet paper. The punch connected. Goku's head moved perhaps 2 centimeters to the side, an adjustment so minimal it might have been involuntary. He looked at Homelander, who was now standing directly in front of him, fist still extended, and blinked once. "Good speed," he said, with what appeared to be authentic appreciation. "Really good. You've got more than most people I've met here." Homelander pulled his fist back. Threw another, faster, every reserve of velocity he had. Goku lined slightly right, the fist past his ear. "Is there a limit to how fast you can go?" Goku asked, with the tone of someone asking a genuinely interesting technical question. In the bunker, nobody was writing anything down anymore. The note-taking had simply stopped. The way things stop when the framework they were designed to document has become inadequate. Homelander stepped back, one step which he would not have described as a step back, would not have allowed to be described that way, but which was functionally and geometrically a step back. "Your turn," he said. Goku moved at perhaps 30% of what Ashley's instruments would later characterize as his observable capacity, and the reason she was confident in that 30% figure was that Homelander could see it coming. Not react to it, see it. There was a difference. Seeing something happen and being unable to alter the outcome was meaningfully distinct from being blindsided, and Goku, she would understand later, was making a careful and considered choice about how much to show. The strike hit Homelander in the sternum. He traveled approximately 60 meters through the air before the ground negotiated his stop, plowing a shallow trench in the Nevada hardpan. He was upright again in under a second. Years of combat instinct, the specific reflex of a body that had always been the most powerful thing in the room, and had built its reflexes around that premise. And he stood in the new trench he'd made and breathed and looked across the flat at the man in orange who was standing exactly where he'd been. Not having moved. Not having needed to. Homelander's ears were ringing. This was new, this specific sensation, not pain, not damage, but the particular cognitive disruption of impact that exceeded what his body had been designed to simply ignore, was new. His body had met resistance before, had bled before privately in circumstances Vought had immediately classified, but those instances had required specific weapons, specific compounds. They had required the world to arrange itself deliberately against him. This had been 30% of a casual demonstration. He launched. Everything, all of it, the full catalog of what he was: speed, strength, laser vision at maximum sustained output, the complete arsenal of a being that had been biologically perfected for violence. He hit Goku 17 times in 4 seconds, a combination that had been tested, theoretically, against every recorded soup and found to constitute unsurvivable force. Goku stood in it the way a cliff stands in weather. Not absorbing with effort, not enduring with strain, simply existing in a way that made the force irrelevant. When Homelander stopped, and he stopped because continuing had begun to feel, for the first time in his life, like a behavior that revealed something he didn't want revealed, there was silence over the Nevada flat. The drones circled, the dust settled. Goku uncrossed his arms. He'd cross them at some point during the combination. Anita's team would review the footage 17 times and determine he'd done it not for protection, but out of what appeared to be idle habit, the way a person folds their arms while listening to something only moderately engaging. He looked at Homelander, and his face did the thing that was worse, far worse, than anything else that had happened in the last 4 seconds. It smiled. Not mockingly, not with the cold performance of someone savoring dominance. Genuinely, warmly, the smile of someone who has just been shown something and found it, against their expectations, kind of wonderful. Wow, Goku said, and there was authentic appreciation in his voice, the specific admiration of a fighter for another fighter's capability. You're pretty strong. A brief pause, during which he appeared to be making a calculation or a categorization of some kind, something internal and automatic, for a human. The word landed in the Nevada air and stayed there. Human, said without malice, without strategy, without any awareness, none, not a trace of what it meant to say it to him, to this specific person, in this specific moment, after everything that had just been demonstrated. Said the way you'd state a category, the way you'd describe the color of a sky. Homelander didn't move. This was the thing that Ashley would remember longest, not what happened next, not the expression, not what followed in the days and weeks that came after. What she would remember was the stillness. The 4 seconds of absolute, total stillness in which John, not Homelander, not the construct, not the brand, but whatever lived underneath all of it, processed a single word. His whole life had been a sentence. And the sentence was, "You are not like them." Spoken first by the men in white coats who had watched him through glass, then by the executives who had built his image, then by Madeline Stillwell in the specific manipulative register she'd used that he'd mistaken for love, then by the public who screamed his name and needed him to be above them, needed it, because what was the point of their adoration if he was only equal? His power was the proof. His power was the text and the subtext and the entire argument. He was not human. He was the next thing, the best thing. The thing that humanity had been building toward without knowing it, the thing that Compound V had revealed rather than created, because he needed it to be revelation rather than manufacture. For a human. The category said out loud, the category he had never been placed in, by anyone, even by his enemies, especially by his enemies, because his enemies understood that denying his power was the one argument that didn't work, and so they attacked him differently, attacked the costume or the company or the psychology, but nobody, not once, had simply looked at everything he was and filed it under human and moved on. Nobody had ever looked at him and seen something smaller than themselves. That was the crack. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, nothing visible, nothing the drone cameras would capture at altitude, nothing Ashley could point to in the footage and say there, that's the moment. Just a crack, hairline and deep, running through the foundation of an identity that had been constructed on a single, load-bearing premise. I am the most powerful thing that exists. The premise was false. The crack spread from that falseness now, with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. Homelander flew back to New York without speaking to anyone. Not to Goku, who had watched him go with an expression of mild puzzlement, the look of someone trying to understand why the other person had left before the conversation was finished. Not to Ashley, who had emerged from the bunker with her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. Not to the drone operators or the technical team or the Vought PR associate who'd been tasked with capturing post-event statements. He flew at altitude above the cloud line, where the air was thin and cold, and there was nobody to perform for. Ashley watched the dot of him disappear into the blue on the exterior monitor, and then turned to find Goku standing beside her, having apparently walked over from the testing ground at some point, eating something again. Where he kept getting food was a mystery she'd stopped trying to solve. Did I say something wrong? He asked, and the question was genuine, attentive, the question of someone who cared about the answer. Ashley looked at him for a long moment, at the open face, the honest eyes, the complete absence of agenda. No, she said carefully, you said something true. He considered this, those are usually the same thing. Not here, Ashley said, and walked back toward the transport. In the debrief, which happened without Homelander because Homelander had gone to the penthouse, and the laser burn marks on the walls of the executive floor that night were the worst anyone had seen, Edgar sat with Ashley and two senior psychologists and the footage. They watched the moment, the 30% strike, the combination that changed nothing, the crossed arms. The smile. The word. He didn't know, Edgar said. No, Ashley agreed. He genuinely didn't know what it would mean. That's almost worse, the senior psychologist said quietly. Edgar rewound the footage to the moment before the word, paused it. Goku's face caught in the pause, carrying that expression of honest admiration, pretty strong for a human, and Homelander's face beside it, carrying the last moment before the crack, the last frame of the architecture before it understood it was standing on nothing. Homelander has survived everything we've put him through, Edgar said, because he has always been able to locate himself in relation to everything else. Above it, beyond it, that's not arrogance, that's the foundation. He looked at the frozen image. That foundation just developed a structural problem. He'll compensate, the psychologist said. He always does. The compensation will be extreme, Edgar said. Yes, he closed the footage. The question isn't how he'll compensate. The question is what he'll decide to compensate against. Ashley looked at her tablet. At the last reading, Anita's team had sent up Goku's field density, the number that had required 6 ceiling raises to fail to quantify. At the smile on that face that didn't know it had just fractured the most dangerous psychology in the world. He'll decide it's Goku, she said. Yes, Edgar said. And Goku can't be touched. Also, yes. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that exists when everyone present understands the shape of what's coming and nobody has a solution to it. So what do we do? Ashley asked. Edgar stood, straightened his jacket, looked out the window at the city that didn't yet know that the two most powerful beings it had ever been in proximity to had stood in a Nevada desert, and that one had walked away with a snack and a puzzled expression, and the other had walked away fundamentally changed. We make sure, he said, that when Homelander decides to prove something, we know about it before he does. He moved toward the door. And we pray, he added without looking back, in the tone of a man who didn't pray, had never prayed, found the concept professionally inconvenient but was briefly, quietly out of better options, that the man in orange is paying attention. Butcher didn't trust good. It wasn't just cynicism, it was a heavy, empirical fact, a conclusion beaten into him over a decade of ripping down curtains and finding the exact same rotting meat behind every single one. Sups were the proof. Every blinding white smile, every staged rescue, every PR-mandated tear, just a cheap curtain. And behind it, raw, psychotic appetite dressed in spandex. Power performing its own justification because nobody had ever been strong enough to smash its teeth in. He knew what sups were. He knew it like the ache in his own bones, knew it like the specific, suffocating weight of a grief he refused to process. It wasn't a belief, it was a blood-soaked, itemized receipt. So when a bloke fell from space, and Vought immediately slapped a logo on him and shoved him in front of the cameras, Billy Butcher's response was pure muscle memory. Pull back the bloody curtain. The manila folder Huey dumped on the table was thick. Butcher genuinely valued the kid's obsessive, nervous thoroughness, even if he'd rather swallow glass than say it out loud. Saying it implied softness that got people killed. Satellite telemetry of the crater. Atmospheric entry data pulled from 3 classified DoD servers by a contact who took payment in untraceable favors. The press conference footage. Butcher watched the footage twice, once at normal speed, once agonizingly slow, scrubbing frame by frame, hunting for the slip, the micro-expression where the performance drops and the monster leaks out. He watched the smile. The real one, the one Goku flashed when he didn't realize the red light on the camera was on. That was the only one that mattered. Butcher stared at the monitor until his eyes burned. Bloke looks like a golden retriever someone taught to punch through buildings, Butcher grunted, scrubbing a rough hand over his jaw. Huey shifted his weight, looking vaguely guilty. That's yeah, actually, but I mean he seems. Don't go soft on me, Huey. I'm not going soft, I'm just saying he seems. They all seem, Butcher snapped, slamming the file shut. The heavy smack of cardboard echoed in the dingy room. But he couldn't stop thinking about that stupid, empty smile. The investigation took 3 weeks and 4 different angles. Butcher was digging with the frantic, obsessive energy of a man desperate to find a tumor just to prove the X-ray wasn't lying. And repeatedly, he just hit solid rock. He started with the money. Money was the primary artery. Every soup had a slush fund. Side deals, offshore accounts, the dark financial architecture that told you exactly what a god actually valued when the cameras were off. Butcher used a chain-smoking forensic accountant in a cramped Queens walk-up who asked 0 questions as long as the cash was unbanded. She had dug up Homelander's buried trust funds. She had pulled A-Train's records and found enough dirt to bury the speedster twice over. On Goku, she found absolutely nothing. Not a shell company, not a hidden asset, literal nothing. Once fast and once slow, the way you watched anything where performance and reality might have different frame rates. He'd watched the smile. The real one, the one that didn't know it was being watched, which was the only kind that told you anything. He'd watched it for a long time. Bloke looks like a golden retriever someone taught to punch through buildings, he'd said. Actually, that's kind of accurate, Huey had said, with the slight discomfort of someone who'd had a similar thought and felt vaguely guilty about it. Don't go soft on me, Huey. I'm not going soft, I'm just saying he seems. They all seem, Butcher said and closed the file. But he hadn't stopped thinking about the smile. The investigation took 3 weeks and 4 different methodologies, because Butcher was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they're looking for something specific and finding, repeatedly, that it isn't there. He started with money. Money was always the first thread. Every soup had money somewhere, not just the vault salary, but the side arrangements, the private agreements, the financial architecture that revealed what a person actually valued when the cameras weren't running. He had a contact at 3 separate banks, a forensic accountant who worked out of a second-floor office in Queens and asked no questions in exchange for fees that Butcher paid in cash. The accountant had found things on Homelander's private accounts that had never seen daylight, had found things on A-Train's records that would have ended his career twice over. On Goku, she found nothing. Not suspicious nothing, not carefully laundered nothing, not the specific clean blankness of someone who knew how to hide, just nothing, no account in any system she could access. No payment received, no contract signed, no financial relationship with Vought or any subsidiary, any shell, any third-party entity she could trace. He existed in the economic infrastructure of the planet with the footprint of someone who had never once treated it as a mechanism to exploit. He's not in the system, she told Butcher. Everyone's in the system. He's not by choice, he just doesn't seem to have engaged with it. Butcher sat with that for a day. Then he moved to the second thread. The second thread was behavior. He pulled every available recording, every interview fragment, every piece of ambient footage the drone teams had captured, every clip from the dozen or so phone cameras that had caught him in public before Vought's social media management team could get to them. He watched hours of it in the dark of the safe house, while Frenchie made something on the stove that smelled aggressively of garlic and red at the table, with the focused stillness of a man who was also watching with his peripheral vision. What Butcher was looking for, the gap, the moment where the performance slipped, where the warmth flickered and something colder showed through, where the answers came too fast or too smooth or carried the microcal. Aberration of someone who prepared them in advance. He watched a journalist ask Goku about his relationship with Vought. They've been nice, Ashley makes sure I have food, I don't really understand the rest of it. He watched someone ask if he considered himself Earth's protector. I don't think of it like that, I'd help if something needed handling, but people can mostly handle things themselves. He watched, and this was the one that stopped him, that made him rewind and watch again, a child outside the Vought tower ask, with the directness children deploy before they learn that directness is complicated, are you the strongest person in the world? And Goku had crouched down to the child's level, not performatively, not for cameras. In fact, the nearest camera was 30 feet away and at a bad angle, and thought about it with the genuine consideration you'd give an interesting question and said right now probably, but that's not really the point. The point is getting stronger. The point is the training, not the number. A pause. Also, there are people back home I haven't fought yet, so maybe not. And then he'd laughed entirely to himself at a joke that only worked if you had context Butcher didn't have. And the child had laughed too, without understanding it, because the laugh was real and real things were contagious. Butcher watched it 4 times. There's no gap, said, from behind the book he wasn't reading. Everyone's got a gap. I've been watching with you for 2 hours, said. There's no gap. Butcher didn't answer. The third thread was history, and the third thread was where Butcher's methodology began to produce results that his framework was not designed to accommodate. He couldn't find records on Goku for obvious reasons. The man was not from here, not in any database, not traceable through any conventional channel, but he could find reactions to him. The response team debrief, which he obtained through a source embedded in Vaught's security division. The early scientific assessment notes, fragments of which had made their way onto a server that Frenchie accessed through a process Butcher had learned not to ask about. The internal communications from the first 72 hours. What the fragments showed consistently was a version of the same sequence: initial threat assessment, aggressive containment preparation, and then nothing, no containment, because there was nothing to contain. Because the subject had not only failed to demonstrate hostile intent, he had apparently spent the first several days asking questions about the planet with the engaged curiosity of a tourist, and helping a Vought maintenance worker fix a freight elevator, which he'd apparently done because he was standing nearby, and it seemed like the worker was having a hard time. The freight elevator thing was in an internal memo. Butcher read it twice. Subject spent approximately 40 minutes assisting building maintenance staff with elevator mechanism failure. No prompting, no cameras present. Staff member described subject as really nice, just wanted to help. He put the memo down. Picked it up again. The fourth thread was the one he hadn't wanted to pull, because pulling it required getting close, and getting close required Butcher to bring his empirical framework into direct contact with the thing it was assessing. And direct contact had a way of complicating empirical frameworks that he'd spent years building. He arranged the meeting through a channel that had nothing to do with Vought, a contact who'd met Goku through a dojo in Brooklyn where Goku had apparently been spending mornings because, he'd explained to the owner, training indoors was more polite to the surrounding geography. The dojo owner, a 58-year-old man named Calvin who had dedicated his life to martial arts and was not easily impressed, described Goku with an expression usually reserved for religious experience. Butcher arrived without announcing himself. Another thing he did on principle, announced arrivals gave people time to become their public-facing self, and Butcher wasn't interested in anyone's public-facing self. Goku was in the dojo's back room, always eating, something that appeared to be a container of rice and vegetables the size of a serving bowl that would have fed 4 people. He looked up when Butcher walked in without the startled response of someone caught off guard, more like the look of someone who'd heard him coming from the hallway and had simply been waiting to see what he wanted. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Butcher said and sat down uninvited in the chair across the small table, because sitting down uninvited was a psychological tactic, and also because his knee was giving him trouble and he was tired. Goku looked at him with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had no reason to perform composure because composure wasn't a performance, it was just the resting state. "You've been looking into me," Goku said, not accusatory, just noting a fact. "Have I?" Butcher said. "For about 3 weeks, based on some of the people who mentioned being asked about me." He ate a forkful of rice. "You didn't find anything bad?" "I haven't finished looking." Goku seemed to consider this fair. "Okay, what do you want to know?" And this was where Butcher's methodology met its first genuine obstacle, because the methodology assumed that the subject would not simply offer to answer questions, because subjects didn't do that, because everyone had something to protect, something to manage, some version of themselves they needed you to believe in. The offer to simply answer was either the most sophisticated manipulation he'd encountered, or it was the thing it appeared to be, and both options were, in their separate ways, disorienting. He asked the question he'd been building toward for 3 weeks. "What?" "You could level this city," Butcher said, "this whole city, any city. You could take out every soup on this planet inside of an hour and there's nothing anyone could do about it." He watched Goku's face. "So why don't you?" Goku put down the fork. Not because the question troubled him, his expression didn't carry trouble. He put it down because the question deserved full attention, and he was the kind of person who gave things the attention they deserved. Why would I? He said. Power, Butcher said. Control, because you can. In my experience, that's usually sufficient reason. Goku looked at him steadily. In your experience, he repeated, and said it without judgment but with the quality of someone who was filing something accurately. Without exception, Butcher said, every single one of them, doesn't matter what they say in front of cameras, doesn't matter what the story is, give something enough power and eventually it uses it for itself. Always. He leaned forward slightly. Always. Goku was quiet for a moment. That sounds exhausting, he said finally. Butcher blinked. Of all the responses his framework had prepared him for, this was not among them. Exhausting. Spending your whole life waiting for things to become what you already decided they are. He said it without pity, which made it land differently than pity would have. That must be really tiring. I'm not waiting, Butcher said, and heard dimly the slight edge in it that he hadn't intended. I'm watching. There's a difference. Is there? Not provocative, genuinely asking. Butcher looked at him, at the open face, the direct eyes, the complete absence of the thing he was always looking for, the tell, the flicker, the ghost of appetite behind the presentation. He'd been in this room for 6 minutes and the curtain was still a curtain, except he was beginning to develop the unwilling suspicion that there was nothing behind it, that the curtain wasn't concealing something. That the curtain was just a curtain, and behind it was the same thing that was in front of it, a person who was exactly what he appeared to be. Which was, in Butcher's experience, so far outside the range of normal as to constitute its own category of alarming. What do you actually want? Butcher asked. Not the VOT line, not the press conference answer. What do you want? Goku picked up the fork again, thought about it, actually thought the real kind, not the performed kind. To get stronger, he said, to find good fights, to protect people who need it. He paused, to figure out what's wrong with the energy here. That's it. That's it. No empire, no legacy, no nothing. Goku looked slightly puzzled by the intensity behind the question. What would I do with an empire? Most people with your kind of power don't ask that question, Butcher said. They already know the answer. Then most people with power are thinking about it wrong, Goku said simply, and went back to the rice. Butcher left the dojo 40 minutes later. He walked for a while without direction, hands in his pockets, through Brooklyn streets that were doing their usual indifferent business. And he thought about the conversation with the specific focus of a man dismantling an argument he'd spent years constructing and finding, piece by piece, that the materials were still sound, but the structure they'd been arranged into might need revision. It wasn't that he believed everything. Believing everything wasn't in his nature and probably never would be. Trust was a mechanism he'd had removed early and painfully, and the surgery had been too thorough to reverse. But there was something, a distinction he hadn't had language for before, that the conversation had given him. He'd spent years establishing that power corrupted. He'd watched it happen in real time, watched good intentions curdle under the specific pressure of unlimited capability and zero accountability. He'd watched Compound V turn human beings into something that wore human beings like a costume. He'd watched sups believe their own mythology until the mythology became more real to them than the people they were supposed to be protecting. What he hadn't encountered, what he hadn't allowed for, because the data hadn't required it, was a version of power that had never needed the mythology. That hadn't been manufactured, hadn't been sold a story about itself, hadn't been conditioned to understand its value in relation to the powerlessness of everything around it. Power that had simply grown, earned, accumulated through effort over time in a context where other things were also powerful, where the ceiling kept rising because the ceiling was defined by whoever you hadn't fought yet. Power that was oriented outward rather than inward, not as a decision, not as a moral stance, but as a fundamental characteristic, the way some animals are simply not predators. Heroes should protect people. He'd said it in the dojo near the ND in response to something Butcher had said about how protection was usually a story sups told to justify the arrangement. He'd said it the way you'd say the sky was blue or water was wet, not as a position, not as an ideology, not as a brand, just as a fact about the shape of things. That's what heroes are for. Butcher stood at a corner and watched a cab go through a yellow light and thought about a word he hadn't applied to a soup in 9 years. Genuine. The thing was genuine. Which should have been a relief and was instead, in the specific way of Butcher's psychological landscape, something considerably more complicated. Because if the thing was genuine, if one version of this was real, if power and goodness could coexist without the goodness being a performance that power was wearing temporarily, then the framework had a gap in it. Not a flaw, not exactly, but a gap. And gaps, in Butcher's experience, demanded to be filled. He pulled out his phone, called MM. "I need you to run something for me," he said. "Find what you were looking for?" MM asked. Butcher was quiet for a moment. "That's the problem," he said. "I didn't find anything." He paused. "I need you to tell me why that's worse." MM was quiet for a moment. "Because it means you have to update the model," he said, carefully. "Yeah," Butcher said. Another pause. "Can you do that?" MM asked. Butcher looked down the Brooklyn street, at the ordinary machinery of a city going about its ordinary business, indifferent to the fact that somewhere above it, a man who could end it entirely was choosing, continuously, not to. Not out of restraint, not out of calculated benefit, out of something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary Butcher had built his life inside. "Working on it," he said, and hung up. He wrote 3 words in the notebook he kept for cases. Underlined them once, then again. "He means it." Below that, after a long pause, he wrote a question he didn't have an answer to, the question that the whole investigation had been quietly building toward, the question that mattered more than anything he'd found or failed to find. What does this place do to something like that? He looked at it for a while. Closed the notebook. Went back out into the city that didn't deserve what was about to happen to it and wouldn't see it coming, and probably wouldn't understand it even after it arrived. The collision between a world that had decided power was corruption and a person who was proof that it didn't have to be. Butcher had spent 9 years being right about sups. He was not, he realized, walking through the cool Brooklyn air with the weight of a notebook in his pocket and a framework with a new gap in it, prepared for what it felt like to be wrong. This so far after listening my mind question was asked on a Tuesday. Not during a press conference, not in a controlled media environment with pre-screened journalists and Ashley Barrett standing 6 feet off camera making the specific facial expression that meant stay on script. Just on a Tuesday on a bridge in Lower Manhattan, during a structural collapse that had begun at 11:40 a.m. when a support cable failed on the Grayson overpass and 14 vehicles found themselves making an unplanned relationship with physics. Goku had been eating lunch on a rooftop 4 blocks away. He arrived before the emergency services dispatcher had finished the first call, not because he'd been monitoring, not because Vought had a notification system pinging him, but because he'd heard the metal fail, heard the specific acoustic signature of load-bearing material giving way, heard the pitch of it change in the half-second between integrity and collapse, and had simply moved. The rescue took 11 minutes. 14 vehicles, 23 people. 3 of them required careful extraction from crushed cabins, which he handled with a precision that the structural engineers who reviewed the footage later described in their professional assessment as extraordinary. Not just the strength but the delicacy, the understanding of how compromised metal behaved, the way he supported weight with one hand while creating exit space with the other, the continuous automatic calculation of where force could be applied and where it would cause cascading failure. He set the last person down, a woman in her 50s, a contractor named Denise who had been on her way to a job site and who would later describe the experience in an interview that got 40 million views, and looked around at the bridge with the expression he had when he was cataloging something, adding it to an internal record. The press had arrived by minute 7. Of course, they had structural collapses in Lower Manhattan were not quiet events, and 3 different outlets had camera crews within range before the dust had finished settling. Among them was a reporter named Carla Voss, who worked for an independent news network that was one of the remaining outlets. Without a Vought advertising contract, a fact that was about to become extremely relevant. Carla was 29 and had spent 2 years covering the soup beat, which meant 2 years of Vought press releases and choreographed rescues and interviews conducted in environments so controlled they were essentially theatrical productions. She had developed through this experience the specific professional hunger of a journalist who has been fed a consistent diet of managed narrative and can feel in her bones the shape of something unmanaged. She pushed through the gathering crowd with her cameraman behind her. "Can I ask you a few questions?" she called. Goku looked at her, looked at the camera, looked back at her with the open, unhurried attention he gave everything. "Sure," he said. The first 3 questions were standard. She'd asked them in some form 100 times. What happened? How did you respond? Is everyone okay? He answered all 3 with the same direct simplicity. He always brought factual, unembellished, containing nothing that could be shaped into a headline because it wasn't trying to be anything other than accurate. Then Carla asked the 4th question, which was not standard, which she asked because she was standing next to a man who had just pulled 23 people out of a collapsing bridge in 11 minutes without being dispatched, without a contract, without any of the infrastructure that Vought maintained was necessary for heroism to function. And the contrast between what she was looking at and what she spent her professional life covering had become, in this specific moment, too sharp to politely ignore. Vaught's standard emergency response contract with the city, she said, includes a per-incident fee. For a rescue of this scale, the billing rate would be approximately $1.2 million. She paused. "Do you think heroes should charge for saving people?" Goku looked at her. Not with discomfort, not with the sudden careful recalibration of someone who recognizes a loaded question and needs to navigate it. With what appeared to be genuine, first-contact puzzlement, the expression of someone encountering a concept that doesn't parse and is trying to understand it from first principles. "Wait," he said, "they charge money." "Standard contracted rate, yes." He looked at the bridge, at the crushed vehicles, the displaced concrete, the people wrapped in emergency blankets being guided toward ambulances by paramedics who had arrived to find the critical work already done. He looked back at Carla. "To save people," he said. "Yes." A pause, not a long one, just the pause of someone whose mind is moving through something. "Why?" he asked. Carla opened her mouth. Closed it. Because the question was so direct and so complete that it had walked straight past the complex architecture of industry justification. The infrastructure costs, the training investments, the corporate necessity, the entire elaborate framework that Vaught's communications team had spent decades building, and landed on the thing underneath all of it, the foundational question that the architecture existed to make sure nobody asked in quite this way. "Why?" That's a question for Vought, I think," Carla said, in the tone of a journalist who has just understood that she is holding something significant. Goku said and looked at the bridge again, and his face carried the particular quality it had when something was being filed internally. Not judgment, not outrage, just the quiet addition of a data point to a picture that was becoming clearer. "Does it bother you?" Carla asked. He thought about it honestly. "I don't really understand it," he said. "Back where I'm from, in the places I've been, if someone needed help, you helped them. That was the whole thing, that was what it meant." He paused. "Charging for it feels like," another pause, searching for the right word with visible effort, not performing the search but actually conducting it, like charging someone for being a decent person. Carla kept her face neutral through approximately 4 seconds of extraordinary professional discipline. "One more question," she said. "When Vought announced you as their newest hero, were you paid for that?" "No," he said with mild surprise, as though the alternative hadn't occurred to him. "Why would I be?" The clip was 47 seconds long. It went live at 2:15 p.m. By 4 p.m. it had 12 million views. By 8 p.m., 44 million. By the following morning, when Ashley Barrett walked into Vought Tower having not slept and still in the previous day's clothes, it had been viewed, shared, reacted to, analyzed, and weaponized across every platform in a way that Vaught's social media team described, in their emergency briefing, as beyond containment architecture. The phrase that was everywhere on news chyrons, in trending topics, in the mouths of morning show hosts who were doing the specific performance of asking questions they already knew were going to generate maximum engagement, was the question itself. Why? Just that, sometimes with punctuation, sometimes without, on signs outside Vaught's regional offices in 4 cities by the following afternoon. #meme. the kind of two-letter crystallization that happens when a question that has been circling in the cultural atmosphere for years finally finds a form simple enough to spread. Why? The numbers came in waves, and each wave was worse than the last. Vought's public approval rating, which had maintained a steady 71% for 6 consecutive quarters, and which their communications team had treated as a kind of natural phenomenon, stable, reliable, beyond the reach of individual events, dropped 9 points in 72 hours. Then another 6. The decline wasn't even across demographics. Among 18-34-year-olds, the drop was 23 points, which the research team described in terms that made clear they understood they were watching a structural shift rather than a news cycle. The comparisons started within hours of the clip going live and did not stop. They were everywhere in every form: professionally produced video essays and phone-recorded rants and academic op-eds and late-night monologues and comment sections that ran to thousands of entries. The structure was always the same. On one side, Goku arriving at a bridge before the dispatch call was finished, pulling people from wreckage with careful hands, answering questions with honest puzzlement about the concept of charging for human life. On the other side, the accumulated archive of the Seven's managed heroism, the staged rescues, the billing records that journalists were now pulling and publishing with new context, the gap between what the heroes said in front of cameras and what the cameras occasionally caught when they didn't know they were running. Someone compiled a supercut, for minutes meticulously edited, no narration, just alternating footage. Goku at the bridge, a train's energy drink commercial. Goku sitting on a curb talking to the woman he'd pulled from the car, Denise, just talking to her, no cameras pointed at him, clearly unaware of the drone footage that had captured it. Homelander at a Vought-branded charity gala, laser smile at maximum output, surrounded by executives. Goku helping the maintenance worker with the freight elevator, identified now that people were looking, the internal memo having leaked through a source nobody at Vought had identified yet. The supercut had 90 million views in 4 days. Nobody at Vought could find a specific thing to dispute in it, which was, their legal team noted grimly, in some ways the worst possible situation. Ashley presented the full damage assessment to Stan Edgar on Thursday morning, because Stan Edgar received information in full regardless of whether the information was comfortable, having understood early in his career that the executives who asked their teams to soften bad news were always the ones who didn't see catastrophe coming. She laid it out without preamble: approval ratings, revenue projections revised downward by 14%, 3 sponsor reviews triggered, 2 congressional inquiries initiated, a class action filing in California challenging the legality of per-incident rescue billing under a framework a constitutional lawyer was calling the Goku standard in a brief that had been downloaded 800,000 times. Edgar listened to all of it without interruption. "The congressional inquiry is the one that matters," he said when she finished. "Yes. The billing model doesn't survive serious legislative scrutiny. We've always known that. The scrutiny never came because the alternative never existed." He was quiet for a moment. Now the alternative is standing on a bridge in an orange suit asking why. Ashley waited. "He doesn't know he did this," Edgar said. "No, I don't think he fully understands." The mechanism, correct. He asked a genuine question because it was a genuine question to him. He wasn't trying to burn anything down. Edgar stood, moved to the window, the posture he adopted when he was thinking rather than performing thought. "That's almost poetic. We've survived deliberate attacks for 20 years. Campaigns, exposes, internal leaks. We survived all of it because it was targeted. You can discredit a target, you can muddy a source, you can create enough noise around a specific threat to neutralize it." He turned slightly. "You cannot discredit a man asking why in front of a camera when he has just pulled 23 people from a bridge for free." "No," Ashley agreed. "Because the why doesn't require him to be right, it just requires the question to exist, and now it exists." He looked out at the city. "It will always have existed from this point forward. Every piece of media, every inquiry, every public conversation about what we do and how we charge for it, it will reference that clip. It becomes the context everything else lives inside of." A pause, 47 seconds. The room was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that lives inside large, irreversible things. "What do we do?" Ashley asked. We make him ours, Edgar said, publicly, thoroughly, in a way that makes the question about our model become a question about his model. We announce a new VOT initiative, comprehensive, zero-cost emergency response. We attribute the inspiration to our partnership with him. We take the fire and we stand in front of it and we say we built it. He said it with the flat professionalism of a man who had been converting threats into assets for 30 years and found the process neither satisfying nor troubling, simply necessary. We turn his integrity into our branding. Ashley looked at her tablet, and if he publicly contradicts the framing. He won't, Edgar said, not deliberately. He doesn't operate that way. He's not trying to tear us down. He'll accept the gesture in good faith because good faith is how he processes everything. He moved back to his desk. The danger isn't that he'll fight us. The danger is that he'll keep being exactly what he is, and every time he is, the comparison becomes more visible. So we need to manage the comparison. We need to close the gap, Edgar said, or appear to. The appearance is sufficient in the short term. He opened the folder in front of him. Long term is a different problem. Homelander watched the clip once. Just once, which was unusual. He watched things that bothered him repeatedly, had the specific compulsive relationship with footage that people have when they're trying to extract control from a situation that keeps refusing to yield it. Once was enough. Not because of the billing question. He didn't care about the billing question, had never thought about the billing question. Money was a prop in the architecture of his life rather than something he needed. What he watched, what he sat with in the penthouse with the television light crossing his face, was the crowd at the bridge. The way they looked at Goku when he set down the last person. Not with relief exactly, not with the electric, complicated mix of fear and gratitude and need that Homelander had spent his life cultivating and consuming. Something quieter, something that didn't have an agenda. The way people look at something that simply did the right thing because it was the right thing, without the performance, without the brand, without the whole elaborate theater that Homelander had been taught was inseparable from heroism. He turned off the television. Sat in the dark. The crack from Nevada, the hairline fracture in the foundation, had been getting wider, not visibly, not in any way that the psychological team, or Ashley, or Edgar could measure on any instrument they had, but he felt it, in the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives, the way the body knows something the mind hasn't formulated yet. The world was changing the way it looked at power. Not away from power, it would never look away from power. That was one of the things he understood about people, had always understood. It was one of the few things he trusted. But the meaning of it, the story of it. For as long as he could remember, the story had been, power is the point, power justifies. Power is the distance between what he was and what they were, and the distance was the relationship, and the relationship was everything. The man on the bridge had the power. More power than Homelander would ever have, and the number wouldn't close, and somewhere in the part of him that processed truth without his permission, he knew the number wouldn't close. And the man had used it to pull people from metal, and asked why anyone would charge for it. And the crowd had looked at him like he was simple. Like what he'd done was the most obvious thing in the world. Like it didn't require explanation or justification or a brand or a billing structure or 40 years of corporate architecture. Like being strong and helping people was just the point. Homelander stood up from the couch. The television screen, dark now, gave him back his own reflection, the uniform, the jaw, the constructed perfection of everything Vought had built. He looked at it for a long time. When the first line of laser vision hit the screen, it was almost involuntary, the way pressure finds release when the containing structure fails, the way things that have been held together by effort alone eventually, inevitably, stop being held. The screen exploded. The reflection disappeared. In the dark of the penthouse, with the smell of burnt electronics and the distant sound of the city that had spent 30 years looking up at him, Homelander stood in the rubble of the reflection and felt the specific, formless, animal terror of a man who has built his entire identity on being the most necessary thing in the world, discovering 47 seconds at a time. That necessity has a new definition. And he wasn't in it. It didn't start with a declaration. It didn't start with an ultimatum or a press conference or any of the formal architectures through which power usually announced itself. It started the way most catastrophic things start, quietly, privately, in the interior of a person who had been losing something incrementally for weeks and had reached, without announcement, the bottom of their capacity to lose it. It started at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday, when Homelander flew to the Vought Research Annex in New Jersey and walked through 3 key-carded doors and 1 retinal scanner and stood in the foundry and looked at Anita Brewer's equipment and the numbers still displayed on the primary monitor. The numbers that expressed themselves in scientific notation with 11 digits before the decimal point, the numbers that had required 6 ceiling raises to fail to quantify. And stood there for 4 minutes and 14 seconds without moving. Anita's overnight technician, who witnessed this, later described it as the most frightening 4 minutes of his professional life, which was notable given that his professional life had included a level 7 containment failure in 2021. Homelander didn't touch anything. Didn't speak. Left. That was Wednesday. Thursday was the congressional testimony. A Senate subcommittee hearing on emergency services pricing convened in the specific bureaucratic slipstream of the Goku clip, populated by senators who had watched their constituent approval ratings fluctuate in direct correlation with their perceived position on the billing question and had drawn the obvious professional conclusion. Vought's chief operating officer testified for 3 hours. The testimony was competent, prepared, and completely ineffective in the way that competent, prepared testimony always is when the cultural context has already decided what it believes. The clip played in the hearing room. Why? Senators whose understanding of superhero mechanics was, in most cases, thin asked questions that were, in most cases, not really questions but statements wearing question marks. The COO answered all of them with the practiced fluency of corporate legal preparation. None of it mattered. What mattered, what landed, what spread, what became the second most shared piece of media that week, was the moment a senator from Ohio asked a question that had not been in the prepared briefing materials. If your model is correct and the infrastructure of commercial heroism is necessary, can you explain why the individual in question performs rescues of equal or greater effectiveness at no charge? The COO said the situations aren't comparable. The senator said the bridge seems comparable. Homelander watched the clip of this exchange 14 times. Friday was the magazine. Time which still existed and still mattered in the specific way that things matter when they become symbols of a conversation rather than participants in it, published a cover. Split image, left half, Homelander in full uniform, the official Vought portrait, jaw and teeth and performed warmth, everything correct, everything managed. Right half, a frame from the bridge footage, Goku setting down Denise, his back to the camera, no posed angle, just the actual moment of a person being placed gently on the ground by someone who could have crushed her and was instead being careful. The headline, "What is a hero?" No subheading, no qualifier. The question standing alone on the cover of a magazine that had, in its 100-year history, developed a specific talent for distilling cultural moments into their most compressed and lasting form. Homelander's team purchased 40 copies. He burned 37 of them in the penthouse. Kept 3. Looked at them. Burned those 2. Saturday was when Ashley found the note on her desk. Not a memo, not an email chain, not a scheduled communication. A handwritten note on Vought Tower letterhead, in handwriting she recognized immediately because she'd seen it once before on a birthday card he'd signed for a publicist who was later fired, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write correctly and resented the requirement. Tell him to meet me, Sunday, the Plaza, noon. Ashley read it 3 times, felt the specific cold of something moving past the point where management was possible, called Edgar. Edgar was quiet for 6 seconds. Don't facilitate it, he said finally. If I don't facilitate it, Ashley said, he'll do it anyway and we won't have cameras positioned. Another silence. Position the cameras, Edgar said and hung up. She told Goku on Saturday evening. He was at the dojo, which had become his default location for the hours between things, the place he went when he wasn't eating or watching the city, with with the focused attention of someone conducting ongoing research into a puzzle that hadn't fully resolved yet. He was sitting in the back room with his legs crossed, eyes closed, doing the thing that Anita's instruments had identified as controlled management of his own output, the continuous, passive process of existing at a frequency the world around him could physically tolerate. Ashley delivered the message and waited for the response she'd been trying to prepare for on the cab ride over. He opened his eyes. "Is he okay?" Goku asked. Ashley stared at him. "I'm sorry." "He's been off since Nevada," Goku said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting an observation rather than making a judgment. "Something shifted. I've been wondering if I should say something." He paused. "What does he want to do when we meet?" "I think he wants to fight you," Ashley said. Goku nodded slowly, not with eagerness, not with dread, with the expression of someone who has been given a piece of information that explains other pieces of information and is now updating the picture. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Ashley repeated, "just okay." Would it help him? The question was so far outside the coordinates of Ashley's professional framework that she needed a moment to locate a response. Help him. "Sometimes people need to fight something to figure something out," he said simply. "I've seen it before." He looked at her. "Will anyone get hurt?" "Other than," she gestured vaguely. "I won't be hurt," he said without arrogance, just accurately. "I mean bystanders. We'll clear the plaza." He nodded. "Okay, then." Ashley stood at the door of the dojo's back room and looked at a man who had just agreed to let the most unstable being on the planet attack him in public because it might help him, and felt the specific, profound vertigo of someone whose entire professional life had been spent managing the intersection of power and psychology, and who was only now, at this late stage, encountering a version of power that had a completely different relationship with both. "You're not worried," she said, not a question. "About what?" She didn't answer. He already knew she didn't have one. Sunday. The plaza outside Vought Tower had been cleared by 11 a.m. under a cover story about structural maintenance, the kind of bureaucratic misdirection that New York absorbed without complaint, because New York had long since made peace with the fact that its civic infrastructure was managed by forces that didn't fully explain themselves. The camera positions were set, 7 ground angles, 2 aerial drones, a feed running to Vaught's monitoring room where Ashley stood with Anita and a crisis communications team, and the specific feeling of watching something arrive that couldn't be redirected. Edgar was not in the monitoring room. He was in his office 2 floors up with the window. He'd said he didn't need to watch it live. Ashley understood that he meant he didn't want to be in the room where the reactions happened in real time, that he preferred to receive the information processed rather than raw. She understood also, though neither of them had said it, that what was about to happen was outside the range of situations his management architecture had been designed for, and that being proximate to things outside that range was, for Edgar, its own category of exposure. At 11:58, Homelander landed in the plaza. He landed the way he always landed, vertical descent, controlled, the deliberate geometry of someone who understood that arrivals were performances and had perfected this one. Full uniform, the flag, the seal, the jaw. But Ashley had been watching that face for 6 years, had built, out of necessity and survival instinct, a comprehensive internal model of its states and their implications. The face was wrong. Not wrong in any way the cameras would catch at distance, not wrong in any way a person without her specific knowledge would identify, but wrong in the way she'd learned to recognize in the very early hours of very bad days, a wrongness in the eyes specifically, a quality of absence where the performance usually was, as though the part of him that maintained the gap between interior and exterior had, in this specific hour, stopped maintaining it. He wasn't performing calm. He was calm. The calm of something that has passed through the noise of its own psychology and arrived, on the other side, at a place where the noise has stopped because the decision has been made. Goku walked into the plaza from the east entrance at noon exactly. No entrance, no landing, just walking, hands in pockets, the easy, unhurried movement of someone going somewhere they've decided to go. He saw Homelander and stopped at a distance of maybe 30 feet and looked at him the way he looked at most things, fully, openly, without the protective layering of affect. "Hey," he said. Homelander said nothing. "You wanted to meet," Goku said, not a challenge, just noting the fact of it. "I wanted," Homelander said, and his voice had a quality Ashley had never heard in it, flattened, stripped of the resin. Ants he usually deployed like an instrument, just the voice underneath the instrument, smaller and stranger, to settle something. Goku looked at him steadily. "Okay. You've been here 2 months," Homelander said, and everything, a pause, fractional but real, the pause of someone managing the gap between what they feel and what they'll allow themselves to say, has changed. "I know," Goku said quietly. "You didn't do anything," Homelander said, and there was something in it that might have been accusation and might have been something more desperate than that. "You didn't campaign, you didn't attack, you didn't try to take anything, he stopped." "Was here," Goku said. "Existed," Homelander said, and the word came out with a force that surprised Ashley from behind the monitor, the force of something that had been compressed for weeks. "You just existed and it was enough to," he stopped again. His fists were closing. "I have been everything they asked me to be, everything, since the beginning. Every performance, every rescue, his voice dropped, every single thing they needed from me, I gave them. And you show up and you don't give them anything and they..." He stopped. The sentence didn't finish. It didn't need to. In the monitoring room, nobody spoke. Goku's expression had shifted, not much, nothing dramatic, just a settling, a deepening of attention, as though the person inside the open face had moved closer to the surface. "I know," he said again, softer. "Don't," Homelander said. "John, the heat vision came." Not the calibrated demonstration of Nevada, not the measured output of a being that knows what it can do and is making a considered choice about how much to show. This was everything, simultaneous, the full sustained maximum of what Homelander's biology could generate, both eyes, the kind of output that turned targets into memory. It hit Goku in the face. The plaza around him cracked, heated. The air rippled in a 20-foot radius, the superheated shimmer of a summer road multiplied by an order of magnitude that summer roads don't reach. Goku stood in it. His eyes were closed. Not squeezed shut in resistance, closed the way eyes close when something is simply not a factor. After 3 seconds he opened them and looked at Homelander through the beam with an expression that had moved, in the 30 seconds since the conversation stopped, from attention to something quieter and more considered. Concern. He was concerned. Homelander hit him. He crossed the 30 feet faster than the cameras could track at standard frame rate. Ashley saw it only in the slow-motion review later, the footage that showed Homelander crossing the distance in a fraction of a second, and connecting with a strike that the structural engineers would later calculate from the displacement evidence at sufficient force to demolish a 12-story building. Goku moved 4 inches. 4 inches of displacement. He hadn't braced, hadn't shifted his stance. His feet hadn't moved. His body had absorbed the kinetic information of the strike and distributed it somewhere that wasn't the plaza, wasn't the surrounding buildings, wasn't anywhere that created consequence. He looked at Homelander, who was standing in front of him with his fist still extended. "John," he said. Homelander hit him again. And again. The combination that had failed in Nevada, the full arsenal, everything in sequence and then overlapping speed and strength and heat vision, and the desperate total commitment of something that has decided this is the moment, this is the fight, this is where it gets resolved, here, now in this plaza with these cameras running, in front of a world that has spent 2 months watching the comparison and is about to see it settled. Goku let it happen for 11 seconds. Ashley counted. 11 seconds of Homelander's complete and total capability applied to a man who received it with his arms slightly away from his sides, his feet planted, his face carrying the expression of someone sitting with a difficult thing before deciding what to do about it. Then Goku exhaled. It started in the air. Not in him, not visibly, not yet, but in the air around him, which changed quality the way air changes before lightning, the specific electrical potential of an atmosphere that has been asked to contain something it isn't designed for. The cameras caught it first as a shimmer, then as a pressure distortion, then as something the weather satellites would later flag as an anomalous atmospheric event within a 200-meter radius of the plaza. Homelander felt it before he saw it. He felt it in his teeth first, the same subsonic vibration that had caused every dog within 2 miles of the original crater to howl, transmitted now through the ground and the air and the structure of everything present, a frequency below hearing that was felt in bone rather than processed by ear. He stepped back. 1 step involuntary. Goku's hair rose. Not stood on end, rose, lifted, as though gravity in its immediate vicinity had submitted a revision to its usual operating parameters. The black faded upward like something receding, and what replaced it came from the roots outward, gold, not the gold of dye or light or reflection, but the gold of something generating its own luminosity, the gold of a frequency made visible. The aura arrived next. Ashley had read Anita's reports, had processed intellectually the concept of a field, bioelectric, pervasive, immeasurably dense. She had understood it as a scientific abstraction, a theoretical architecture underlying a set of readings she lacked the specialist knowledge to fully interpret. She understood it now as a physical fact. The aura was visible, not metaphorically, not as an artistic impression, visibly, physically, empirically present, a standing field of gold-white energy radiating from a man standing in a plaza in lower Manhattan, coherent enough to cast light on the surrounding buildings, stable enough to maintain its geometry against the ambient wind, vast enough that the drone cameras had to adjust their exposure settings because they were being overwhelmed. The sound arrived with it. Not loud, almost gentle, a deep, resonant, continuous note felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, the sound of something very large operating at its natural frequency after a period of operating below it, the sound of constraint released. The plaza cracked in a perfect circle outward from where he stood, not violently, not explosively, just the ground acknowledging a weight it had not previously been asked to bear. And Goku stood in awe of it and looked at Homelander. His face was the same. That was the thing Ashley could not stop returning to afterward. Underneath the gold and the aura and the atmospheric disturbance in the cracked plaza and the light that was visibly emanating from a human body, the face was the same. Open, present, carrying that quiet concern. The transformation had changed everything available to physics and left entirely untouched everything that was the person. Homelander stood 12 feet away and looked at what had just happened to the air and the ground and the light, and his chest was heaving, and his fists were still closed, and his face was doing something it had never done in any footage Ashley had reviewed in 6 years of watching it with professional intimacy. It was afraid. Not performing fear, not using fear instrumentally, the way he sometimes deployed the performance of vulnerability to generate response. Afraid, the animal kind, the kind that lives below psychology in the body, in the systems that existed before self-awareness did. His heat vision fired. Maximum output, both eyes, into the aura. The aura absorbed it. Not deflected, not blocked. Absorbed the way the ocean absorbs a stone, acknowledging the event without being altered by it, integrating the energy into something so vast that the addition was arithmetically negligible. Goku moved. There was no moment to observe. The cameras in slow motion would later reconstruct the geometry of it, Goku crossing 8 feet of plaza in a duration too small to express in the frame rates available, one hand open, connecting with Homelander's sternum. But in real time, in the monitoring room, in the experience of everyone present, there was only the before and the after with no perceptible interval. Before, Homelander standing, heat vision active, full output, the terminal expression of everything biology and corporate science had produced in 40 years of trying to build a god. After Homelander in the wall of the Vought Tower lobby, 20 feet inside the building, the entrance having been, in the most technical sense, relocated. The strike had been open-palmed. Not a fist, an open hand, the choice of someone who is not trying to damage, who is applying exactly enough force to resolve the situation, and not one quantum more. Homelander extracted himself from the wall. He was bleeding. From the nose, a small thing physically, the nose bled easily. The nose bled from pressure changes, it meant nothing medically. but it meant everything else because John Homelander had not bled in public in 30 years, and the cameras were running, and the blood was the color of everyone else's blood, and in the monitoring room someone made a sound they immediately suppressed. He stood in the hole in his own building. And Goku was there, having crossed the plaza at some point during the movement, standing in the rubble of the entrance with the aura still present, still gold, and looked at Homelander with an expression that was several things at once, concern still, and something that might have been sorrow, not for the fight but for the shape of what the fight had been about. "Stop," Goku said quietly, not a command, a request. Homelander breathed. His eyes were active, the faint red glow of heat vision at idle, the S. Ustum running hot without firing, the weapon that had never before encountered a target it couldn't conclude. "You're strong," Goku said. The words landed in the rubble between them. "You're genuinely strong," he said it without condescension, without the strategic deployment of praise as a softening mechanism. He said it the way he said true things because it was true, and truth was the only register he operated in. "I've been on a lot of worlds, in a lot of fights. You're stronger than most things I've met." He paused. "Naturally, what you are, what your body can do, that's real." Homelander said nothing. The blood ran. "But you never trained," Goku said. The silence had weight. Physical weight, the kind that changes the acoustics of a space, that lands on the people inside it as something more than the absence of sound. "You never trained," said simply, without cruelty, without the performance of a lesson being delivered, said the way you state a structural fact about a thing. The foundation is here, the load-bearing wall is there, the gap is in this location. Homelander's entire life had been the premise that training was irrelevant, that what he was required no cultivation because cultivation was for things that needed to become, and he had arrived complete. The power had always been there, fully formed, a gift he hadn't asked for and didn't need to develop because development implied a starting point below the finish line, and he had begun at the finish line. That was the story, that was the architecture. "You never trained," meaning what you have is the beginning, not the end. Mining all of this, the power, the speed, the heat vision, the 4 decades of being the largest thing in every room, is the starting point for what you could become if you had chosen to build it rather than simply inhabit it. Mining, you have lived your whole life at potential and called it achievement. The heat vision stopped. The glow faded from his eyes. He stood in the rubble of his own building, bleeding from the nose, in the full uniform of everything he was supposed to be, and for the first time in his constructed existence, the uniform was a costume rather than a skin, something worn rather than something was, something that could be taken off, which meant it could also be taken. He looked at Goku, at the gold still present in the air around him, not aggressive, not victorious, just there, the natural state of something that had removed a constraint temporarily and had not yet seen reason to reapply it. "How long?" Homelander said, and his voice was the voice underneath the voice, the one Ashley had heard once before and never expected to hear again. "Would it take?" Goku looked at him. "To train," Homelander said. "How long?" The question sat between them in the rubble. Goku's expression moved through something that resolved, after a moment, into the specific quality of attention he gave things that mattered. "Depends," he said, "on whether you want to get stronger or whether you want to prove something." Homelander looked at the blood on his upper lip, at the walls of the building that bore his sponsor's name, at the cameras that were running, had captured everything, the combination that changed nothing, the aura, the open-handed strike, the wall, the blood, the 2 words that were already moving through the world's networks at the speed of something that cannot be recalled. "Never trained." "What's the difference?" he asked. "Everything," Goku said. The aura faded. The gold receded. The man in orange stood in the rubble of a lobby and looked at the most dangerous psychology on the planet and waited, with the patience of someone who had waited through longer silences in more consequential places, for an answer that might not come today, might not come for a long time, might require everything that came next before it could be given. Ashley in the monitoring room was not watching the screens. She was watching Edgar's face on the internal camera, the one feed from his office, the feed he didn't know she'd added to her monitor configuration 2 years ago, because knowing where he was and what his face was doing had kept her alive professionally on 3 separate occasions. He was standing at the window. He had watched it despite what he'd said. And his face was doing something she had never seen it do in 8 years, not processing, not strategizing, not performing the calm of a man who has already determined his next move. Just watching, the face of someone who has seen something that does not fit inside the available architecture and has not yet decided what to do about the gap. Below them, in the rubble of the lobby, 2 figures stood in the settling dust. One bleeding, one waiting. Both for this one suspended moment, simply present in a world that was going to be different now, not because anyone had planned it, not because a strategy had executed, not because power had done what power usually does and taken what it wanted, but because a man from somewhere else had transformed in a plaza and not killed what was in front of him, and asked without agenda whether it wanted to learn. The morning after the fight, the world woke up different. Not dramatically, not with the clean rupture of a before and after that history textbooks would later draw a sharp line through. It woke up the way most genuine change arrives, through the accumulation of small things that had been building for longer than anyone wanted to admit, until one event provided the final, critical pressure that converted accumulation into transformation. The fight in the plaza was not the cause. It was the moment when the cause became visible, the way a fault line is not created by the earthquake but is revealed by it. The footage had run everywhere. Not Vought's footage, they'd pulled their feed within the hour, cited ongoing emergency protocols, deployed the standard architecture of information management that had served them in every previous crisis. But there had been 47 phones in the buildings surrounding the plaza, held by people who had not evacuated as completely as the cover story required, and 47 phones produced 47 angles, and 47 angles produced a composite that no single suppression effort could address because it was everywhere simultaneously before the first takedown notice was filed. The aura, the gold, the cracked plaza, the open hand, the blood, the words captured on 3 separate audio tracks at sufficient quality that there was no dispute about them, that had already been clipped and isolated and set against black backgrounds in white text, and distributed with the specific viral velocity of things that land on the precise frequency of what a culture has been waiting to hear said out loud. You never trained. By morning it was everywhere. By noon, the never-trained construction had entered the language. Editorials were using it, late-night hosts were using it. A senator from Vermont used it in a floor speech about regulatory accountability, and the clip of her using it got 4 million views before dinner. But the 2 words that moved fastest, that traveled furthest, that landed in the most places and stayed, were the ones that came later. The ones that weren't about Homelander at all. Better ones. The congressional hearing that had been scheduled for 3 weeks out was moved to Monday. Not the subcommittee, the full Senate Commerce Committee, with 4 additional members requesting seat assignments and C-SPAN running live coverage that pulled, by the second hour, viewership numbers the network hadn't seen since a presidential address. Vought's legal team sent their best. Their absolute best, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had spent 22 years making regulatory problems disappear through a combination of technical expertise, strategic misdirection, and the specific institutional confidence of someone who had never lost a hearing she'd adequately prepared for. She had adequately prepared for this one. It didn't help. Because the committee had the footage, all 47 angles. They had Anita's leaked scan results, which had found their way to 3 journalists simultaneously through a channel nobody at Vought had identified yet, in which Anita, sitting in her New Jersey lab watching the hearing on her laptop, did not feel guilty about. They had the billing records, contextualized now against the bridge rescue, the comparison made concrete and numerical and impossible to abstract away. They had 30 years of incidents that had been individually manageable and were now, assembled in sequence with new eyes, a pattern. They had most damagingly the question, why? Patricia Holt answered questions for 6 hours. She answered them with precision and competence and the absolute professional commitment of someone who believes in the work regardless of the client. At the end of 6 hours, the committee chair, a 71-year-old man from Michigan who had been in the Senate for 26 years and had developed across those years a comprehensive immunity to being impressed, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Ms. Holt, in your professional assessment, and I'm asking for your assessment, not your client's position, is the current framework in which private corporations hold exclusive contracts for superhuman emergency response in the public interest." Patricia Holt was quiet for 4 seconds. "That's not a question I'm positioned to. I'm asking you," the chair said, "not Vought, you." Another silence, longer. "No," she said. The hearing room noise that followed required the gavel 3 times. Holt looked at the table in front of her with the expression of someone who has just said the true thing and is processing the professional consequences. Later, in an interview she gave to a journalist she trusted, she would say that she hadn't PL. And to say it that it had arrived the way true things sometimes do, through a gap in the performance, in the pause between the question and the managed answer, in the space where a person who has spent too long building arguments they don't believe in finally encounters a moment of sufficient clarity. She said she'd been thinking about the question since Tuesday. Since a man in an orange gi had asked it on a bridge. The legislation moved faster than legislation was supposed to move. This was the thing that surprised everyone who understood how these processes worked, the pace of it, the breadth of coalition that formed around it, the specific historical rarity of a political consensus that crossed lines that had held firm for a generation. The Emergency Services Accountability Act, which restructured the relationship between superhuman assets and public emergency response, passed its initial committee vote within 3 weeks. The Superhuman Registration and Oversight Framework, the comprehensive bill that had existed in draft form for years, suppressed through lobbying expenditure that Vaught's financial disclosures now made visible and politically radioactive, was introduced by a bipartisan group of sponsors that would have been unimaginable in any previous news cycle. Vaught's stock price fell 34% in the first week. Then another 19% when 3 of the 7's members, in separate but suspiciously coordinated statements, announced they were seeking independent legal representation. Then another 11% when the Department of Justice announced a preliminary investigation into the circumstances of Compound V's development, testing history, and the question of informed consent in its application to subjects who had not been in a position to provide it, a category of subject that began in public discourse with the SUPs themselves and expanded rapidly as more was examined. Stan Edgar resigned on a Thursday. Not under pressure, the pressure was coming, was visible, was measurable, but it hadn't arrived yet in the formal sense. He resigned before it arrived, which was, Ashley understood when she got the call, entirely characteristic. Edgar's entire career had been about controlling the terms. He had controlled the terms of everything. He was not going to permit the terms of his exit to be controlled by a Senate subpoena. He called Ashley before the announcement went public, a 10-second call. "You're capable," he said, "more than this place deserved." Ashley held the phone after the line went dead and looked at her office, the immaculate desk, the view of the city, the wall of screens that she'd spent 6 years using to monitor the behavior of beings who could have removed the building from the landscape on a bad morning and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not grief exactly, not relief, something in between, in the unmapped territory between the end of something that has defined you and the beginning of whatever comes after, in the specific, disorienting freedom of a structure that was load-bearing suddenly, no longer bearing the load. She looked at the screens. They were mostly dark. Homelander did not attend the hearings. He did not issue statements, did not appear in public, did not engage with the legal process that was constructing itself around Vaught's collapse with the unstoppable procedural momentum of an institution that has located a legitimate target and has decided, for reasons of political survival and genuine public anger in proportions that varied by actor, to pursue it. He was in the penthouse. He had been in the penthouse since Sunday. Ashley sent food. She wasn't sure why habit, maybe, or the residual care of someone who had spent 6 years responsible for the well-being of a thing that had required careful management and had not in that time ever stopped being, underneath all the layers of constructed mythology, a person who had been built in a lab and given to a world that didn't know what to do with him, and told the story of that as greatness. The food was returned, sometimes eaten first, she couldn't tell. On Wednesday, she went in person. She found him at the window, always the city, the relationship with the view that was the only relationship he'd maintained without performance, because there was nobody in the city who could see him back. The lawyers need, she began. I know what the lawyers need, he said. She stood in the room that smelled of burnt electronics and the specific chemical residue of heat vision deployed at close range against objects that hadn't deserved it, looked at the city with him for a moment. He asked if you wanted to train, she said. A long silence. He did, Homelander said. Are you going to? Another silence, different in quality, the silence of something being considered rather than avoided. I don't know what that means, he said. For me, what it would mean to, he stopped. Everything I am was given, I've need. Another stop, the sentence architecture collapsing under the weight of something it hadn't been built to carry. I don't know how to want something I'd have to work for. I've never had to. Ashley looked at his profile against the window light, at the jaw and the uniform and the carefully constructed everything. Maybe that's the start, she said, not knowing. He didn't answer. She left him there. Goku spent Thursday with Butcher. Not by arrangement, Butcher showed up at the dojo the way he did everything, without announcement, and found Goku on the roof watching the city with the particular quality of attention that Butcher had been thinking about since Brooklyn, since the notebook with 3 words in it, since the investigation that had produced a result his framework still hadn't fully processed. He sat down on the roof without being invited because that was how he operated, and Goku acknowledged his presence with a slight nod and continued watching the city, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in a way that Butcher hadn't expected and didn't examine too closely. You're leaving, Butcher said eventually. Not a question. Goku looked at him. How did you know? You've got that look, Butcher said, like someone who's finished something and is deciding where the next thing is. Goku seemed to consider this description and find it accurate. There's something out there, he said, looking up at the sky, not the buildings, not the city, the actual sky, the space above the atmosphere where things waited that the rest of the world wasn't paying attention to yet. I've been feeling it since the fight, something that wasn't there before or I couldn't sense before, or he paused. Something strong and new, out past the edge of the system. And that's enough for you, Butcher said, something strong and new. Isn't it? Butcher thought about that, about the specific pull of a purpose that was entirely its own thing, not manufactured by someone else's need, not organized around an external threat or obligation. Just the intrinsic orientation of a person toward the next horizon, because the horizon existed, and because they were the kind of thing that moved toward horizons. For most people, Butcher said, that would be terrifying, unknown powerful thing out in space. For most people, Goku agreed, without judgment, just acknowledging the distinction. Not for you. He smiled. I've never met a strong fighter I didn't learn something from. Butcher looked at him, at the open face, the honest eyes, the complete, uncomplicated, infuriating integrity of a person who had arrived in a crater and asked about the energy and eaten enormous quantities of rice, and accidentally dismantled an empire by asking a question on a bridge, and transformed into a golden beacon in a plaza, and defeated the most dangerous being on the planet with an open hand, and then asked if he was okay. You changed things here, Butcher said. The things were already wrong, Goku said. I just happened to be here when they were ready to change. That's not entirely accurate, Butcher said dryly. Goku laughed, short and genuine. No, he admitted, maybe not entirely. They sat for a while in the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other in the specific way that comes not from similarity, but from a shared willingness to be honest, which was rarer and more durable than similarity. The kid, Butcher said, Huey, he's been talking about getting involved, properly involved, reform work, oversight commission, making sure whatever comes after Vought is better than Vought. He looked at the city. Same thing everywhere, people who want to fix it. First time I've thought it might actually, that there might be something to fix too. There is, Goku said simply. You sound certain. I'm not certain about most things, he said, but people mostly want to do right. I've seen enough worlds to know that's the constant. He paused. The systems are the problem, the systems that make doing right expensive and doing wrong profitable. He looked at the sky again. You and your team, you know how those systems work. You've spent years inside them. Spent years against them, Butcher said. Knowing how something works from the outside is still knowing how it works, Goku said. Maybe that's what comes next for you. Not fighting the system from underneath it, building the next one correctly. Butcher was quiet for a long moment. I'm not a builder, he said. You built the team, Goku said. Butcher had no response to that. He looked at the city, his city, in the specific sense that a person who has spent decades fighting for a place has a claim on it that has nothing to do with ownership, and thought about the gap in the framework, the one the investigation had opened, the one he'd been circling since Brooklyn. He means it. A person who meant it, who had come from somewhere else and operated by a principle so simple it had made everything complicated look complicated, not sophisticated, not necessary, just complicated. Who had looked at a world that manufactured heroes for profit and asked, with genuine first contact puzzlement, why, and the why had been sufficient to bring a structure down. Bloody hell, Butcher said quietly, not to Goku, to the city, to the decade of work and grief and furious, costly, personal investment that had preceded this moment and had been aiming at exactly this outcome through a completely different route. What? Goku asked. Butcher shook his head slowly. Nothing, he paused, just you're what he pretends to be. He didn't specify who, he didn't need to. Homelander, the whole thing, the story they sell. He looked at the figure beside him in the orange gi against the New York skyline, watching the sky with the uncomplicated attention of someone who had already decided the next direction and was simply enjoying the present one before moving. That's what the story's supposed to be, what they used it to sell. Hero who protects people because it's right, doesn't want anything, doesn't take anything. He made the sound that was his closest approximation of reluctant acknowledgement. You're the actual version. Goku looked at him. I'm just me, he said. Yeah, Butcher said, that's the thing. He left on a Friday. No announcement, no press conference. No Ashley with a media strategy and a prepared statement and 7 angles of drone coverage. He simply walked to an open space, the same plaza, the cracked stone not yet repaired, the geometry of the previous Sunday still visible in the concrete, and stopped and looked around at the city for a moment. Some people had gathered, not a crowd exactly. Word had spread in the specific way that things spread in New York, through the sidewalk network of observation and inference, the city's distributed intelligence determining that something was happening and routing curious people toward it. A few dozen, then more, phones up, but not in the aggressive way, not the media coverage way, the way people hold phones when they want to remember something. Ashley was there. Anita was there with a tablet she wasn't looking at. Was there, hands in his pockets, Frenchie beside him. Kimiko, who watched with the particular attention she gave everything, total, unfiltered, direct. Huey was there because Huey was constitutionally incapable of not showing up to things that mattered. Butcher stood at the back. Goku looked at all of them, at the gathered people, the phones, the faces of a city that was in the process of becoming something it hadn't been before and didn't have the full shape of yet, disoriented, cautious, carrying the specific combination of loss and possibility that exists in the gap between the end of a bad system and the beginning of whatever replaces it. He smiled. The real one, the unmanaged, unbranded, utterly genuine version that had been causing structural damage to carefully constructed frameworks since the night he landed in Gerald Putz's field. You don't need stronger heroes, he said. His voice carried without effort, the way it always did, the way things carry when there's no performance in them and nothing to amplify but the actual content. You need better ones. He looked at the sky. You've got people for that, he said, and it wasn't directed at anyone specifically, or it was directed at everyone generally, in the way that true things are addressed to whoever they fit. People who know how it went wrong and why, people who were angry about it for the right reasons. He paused. The anger doesn't go away when the thing you were angry at does. It's still there. It needs somewhere to go. He looked at the crowd. That's the somewhere. Nobody said anything. The city made its usual sounds, traffic, construction, the ambient density of millions of lives operating simultaneously, and none of it touched the quality of the silence in the plaza. Goku rolled his neck once, the small, loose habit, purely his own. Looked up. The Kai gathered without drama, not the full transformation, not the gold and the aura and the atmospheric event of the plaza on Sunday, just the quiet, functional accumulation of someone preparing to travel. A warmth in the air, a change in the light immediately around him. He rose. Slowly at first, then with the acceleration of something that has made its decision and is committing to it, until he was above the buildings, above the skyline, a point of light ascending against the Friday afternoon blue, getting smaller and smaller in the way that things get smaller as they move away rather than as they diminish, maintaining their nature, just increasing the distance. The crowd watched him go. Nobody spoke until he was gone. Butcher watched until there was nothing to watch. Until the sky was just sky again, blue and indifferent and busy with clouds and aircraft and the regular traffic of a world going about its business, a world that was going to have to build something now, was going to have to decide what the anger was for and where to put it, and what to make of a gap that had been opened in a structure by something that hadn't tried to open it, had just existed in it at a different frequency until the structure acknowledged the incompatibility. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. Thought about a notebook with 3 words in it. Thought about a question he'd written below the 3 words, the question that the whole investigation had been building toward, the one he hadn't had an answer to then and was only beginning to have an answer to now. What does this place do to something like that? Nothing, it turned out. The place had tried everything, the branding, the contracts, the scans, the compounds, the suppression systems, the Homelander, and nothing this place had built had touched it. Not because it was invulnerable, because it was oriented. Because the question this place had asked of every powerful thing it had ever encountered, what do you want, and how much will you take to stop wanting it, had met something for which the question didn't compute. Something that wanted what it wanted, and the wanting had nothing to do with anyone else's expense. The place hadn't done anything to it. And it had done this to the place. Butcher muttered it to the empty sky, low enough that only he could hear it, the way he said the things he meant. Bloody hell. The pause. That bloke was what Homelander pretends to be. The sky didn't respond. He turned up his collar against the wind off the buildings, looked at the cracked plaza, at the people dispersing back to the city's usual business, at Huey who was standing with MM and saying something with his hands, already planning, already building the thing in his head. The relentless, exhausting, necessary optimism of someone who was going to try to make it better and was probably, despite every reason for doubt that the previous decade had provided, going to make some meaningful portion of it better. He looked at that for a while. Then he walked. In space, past the edge of the solar system, past the boundary where the sun's influence faded into the broader dark, Goku moved at a speed that didn't have a unit in any physics textbook on Earth and felt the pull of the thing he'd been sensing since the fight. Something out there. Something enormous and dense and new to this region of space, new to the pattern of energy he'd been tracking since he first felt the wrongness of this world's frequency and began to understand its shape. Something that had noticed the events of the past 2 months, the way powerful things notice other powerful things, the way certain animals navigate by the magnetic field of the earth, feeling the changes before they can be observed. It had felt the gold in the plaza. It had turned toward it. He felt it turn. And his face in the dark between stars, with no camera to record it and no crowd to receive it and no performance required of any kind, did the thing it always did when something like this happened. It lit up. Not with strategy, not with threat assessment, not with the careful calculation of a being managing its advantages against an unknown. With the pure, animal, entirely characteristic joy of a fighter who has just sensed the next horizon. His speed increased. The stars became lines. The dark became motion. And somewhere behind him, on a blue planet that was in the difficult, necessary, entirely possible process of becoming better than it had been, the work continued, in hearing rooms and courtrooms and newsrooms and conversations, in the specific unglamorous daily effort of people who had been angry for the right reasons and had found, unexpectedly, somewhere to put it. Better ones. He'd meant it. He always meant it. That was the whole thing. That was what it meant.